Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 11 years now, and I've always prided myself on knowing what's out there in the wilderness. You spend enough time in the backcountry, you get familiar with the wildlife patterns, the sounds at night, the way shadows play tricks on you when you're tired. But what happened to me 3 weeks ago in Canyon de Chelly has completely shattered that confidence. I haven't told many people about this because, honestly, I'm still trying to process it myself. It was a Thursday night and I was doing some solo camping, something I do pretty regularly to check on more remote areas of the park. The sun had already set by the time I was driving along Road 7, that washboard dirt road that stretches east of Chinley. If you've ever been out there, you know how isolated it gets. No streetlights, no houses, just darkness swallowing everything beyond your headlights. I was creeping along at maybe 20 miles per hour, keeping my eyes peeled for a decent pull-off where I could park my truck for the night. The road was rough as hell, and my suspension was taking a beating, so I was focused on avoiding the worst of the ruts while also looking for camping spots. My high beams cut through the darkness, catching the occasional reflection of eyes from small critters in the brush. The dashboard clock read 10:43. I remember checking it because I was getting tired and wondering if I should just settle for the next semi-flat spot I found. The radio didn't work out there, just static, so I had turned it off about 30 minutes earlier. The only sounds were my engine and the crunch of tires on the dirt road. That's when it happened. About 40 feet ahead of me, something stepped out from the left side of the road. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as something familiar, maybe an elk or a hiker with a backpack, but within half a second I knew it wasn't either of those things. This figure was walking upright on 2 legs, crossing the road with these purposeful strides. Not running, not hurrying, just deliberately moving from one side to the other. It was tall, I'd guess around 6 feet, with proportions that were almost human, but not quite right. The shoulders were too broad in relation to its slim waist, giving it this top-heavy triangular shape, and it was covered in dark hair or fur, not patchy or different colors like you'd see on most animals, but uniformly dark all over. The way it moved was what really got to me. There was this fluidity to its motion that I've never seen in a person or an animal. Each step was precise and balanced, like it knew exactly where to place its feet without looking down. No wasted movement at all. The whole sighting probably lasted 3, maybe 4 seconds at most. Just long enough for it to cross from the left side of the road to the right, fully visible in my headlights. As soon as it reached the other side, it immediately ducked behind some brush, not in a panicked way, but almost like it was following some ingrained habit to stay concealed. I didn't hit the brakes until it had already disappeared. My truck skidded slightly on the loose dirt, and I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was hammering in my chest. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all sorts of wildlife in my career, but nothing has ever made me feel like this, like I just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. My first coherent thought was, that was an elk. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was bullshit. Elk don't walk upright on 2 legs. They don't have that body shape, and they certainly don't move like that. My next thought was, someone in a suit. But who would be out here, miles from anywhere, wearing what looked like a full-body costume? And no costume I've ever seen moves with that kind of natural grace. There was no awkwardness to its gait, no hesitation. I sat there for probably 5 minutes just staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my engine idling. Part of me wanted to back up, turn around and get the hell out of there. But another part, the ranger part I guess, was curious. I'd spent my whole career in these wild places, and I'd never seen anything like this. Eventually, I put the truck back in drive and continued forward, passing the spot where it had crossed. I drove slowly, scanning the brush on the right side of the road, but there was no sign of whatever it was. No movement, no sounds, nothing disturbing the desert night. I kept driving east, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain kept offering explanations. A hiker with unusual gear, maybe someone from one of the nearby communities out for some reason, perhaps even a large animal that my tired mind had misinterpreted. But none of those explanations fit what I'd witnessed. About a mile down the road, I found a small pull-off area that would work for camping. It wasn't ideal, kind of rocky and sloped, but I didn't feel like driving anymore. I backed my truck in, positioning it so I could see the road, and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was intense. No traffic noise, no distant conversations, just the occasional desert wind and the ping of my cooling engine. I sat there for a while, listening and watching, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the darkness again. It hit me that I was probably only 2,000 or 3,000 feet from where I'd had the sighting, not far at all. I debated whether to move on and find another spot, but some stubborn part of me refused to be chased off. This was my job, my territory. Besides, whatever it was hadn't shown any aggression or even acknowledged my presence. I climbed into the back of my truck where I had my sleeping setup, just a foam pad, sleeping bag, and a small cooler with supplies. I always sleep with my windows cracked for air, but that night I made sure they were just barely open. Enough for ventilation, but not enough for anything to reach in. I also kept my bear spray and flashlight right next to my pillow. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying those few seconds in my head, trying to fit what I'd seen into some category that made sense. The proportions, the movement, the deliberate way it hid, none of it matched anything I was familiar with. And I've spent over a decade studying the wildlife in this region. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. You know that feeling when you just sense something's watching you? That's what it was. No sound had woken me, just this overwhelming sensation of being observed. I lay completely still, ears straining for any sound outside the normal night noises. For several minutes there was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft footfall on the dirt road, just a single step, like something had shifted its weight. My hand closed around the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Part of me wanted to look, to confirm what was out there, but another part was terrified of what I might see. So I just lay there, barely breathing, listening. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, I heard more footsteps, this time moving away. They were spaced and measured, just like the stride I'd seen earlier. They continued for maybe 30 seconds before fading completely. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there, eyes open, watching the ceiling of my truck and waiting for dawn. When the first grey light finally appeared, I was already packing up my gear. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just wanted to get back to headquarters and some sense of normalcy. The drive back was surreal. In the daylight, the area looked so ordinary, just scrubby desert vegetation, red dirt, and the occasional bird. Nothing to suggest that anything unusual had happened there. I found myself questioning my own experience. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was I more tired than I realized? But I know what I saw. And more. Importantly, I know what I felt. That wasn't just an animal or a person in the wrong place. It was something fundamentally different, something that moved with an awareness and purpose that felt intelligent. I've been back to work since then, doing my regular patrols and tasks. I haven't returned to that specific stretch of Road 7, though. Not yet. I've looked through wildlife guides, searched online for similar sightings in the area, even cautiously asked some of the local Navajo if they have stories about creatures in the canyon. I've gotten some strange looks, but no real answers. The thing is, I don't know what to do with this experience. File a report? Who would I even report this to? And what would I say? I saw a Bigfoot-like creature crossing the road. I'd be laughed out of my job. So I'm just sitting with it. This knowledge that there's something out there that doesn't fit into my understanding of what's supposed to exist in these canyons. Something that walks like a person but isn't a person. Something that knows how to hide. I still go out on solo patrols. I still camp in remote areas. It's my job, and I love it. But now, when darkness falls and I'm alone in the wilderness, I find myself listening more carefully, watching the shadows more closely. And sometimes, when the night is especially quiet, I wonder if it's out there too, watching and listening just as intently. I don't know what I encountered that night. I just know that the wilderness I thought I understood now feels like a different place entirely. And no matter how many rational explanations I try to create, I can't shake the feeling that for those few seconds, I glimpsed something that most people will go their whole lives without seeing. Something that challenges everything I thought I knew about what's really out there in the dark. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for years. I'm not one for ghost stories or making up tall tales. I have a background in sociology and anthropology from UGA, so I'm trained to approach things rationally and look for logical explanations. But what happened that night outside my home in Asheville still gives me chills, and I honestly can't explain it. This happened about 6 years ago. I was living on this wooded property outside Asheville, North Carolina. Beautiful area, but isolated. My house sat at the end of this long, winding driveway that cut through dense forest. There was a small church nearby, and my property backed up against thick woods that seemed to go on forever. That night started like any other. It was around midnight, and I needed to take the trash out to the dumpster at the end of my driveway. It was one of those clear, quiet nights where you can hear everything: crickets, the occasional owl, the wind in the trees. I remember it was chilly, but not cold enough for a heavy coat, just cool enough that I could see my breath if I exhaled hard. I dragged the trash bags down the driveway, using my flashlight to guide the way. The driveway was about 200 yards long, winding through trees that made it completely dark at night. I dumped the trash and started heading back, clicking my flashlight on and off to conserve the battery. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just another quiet night. As I got closer to my house, I noticed the motion-activated light on my garage had turned on. At first, I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. We got a lot of wildlife out there. But as I got closer, I saw something moving near my garage that made me freeze in my tracks. Under the garage lights, there was this figure. I don't know what else to call it. It was tall, at least my height, and I'm 6 feet. But it seemed even taller. The color was wrong for a person, this brownish hue that didn't look like clothing or skin. And the way it moved, God, the way it moved is what still haunts me. It didn't walk like a person walks. There was no bobbing up and down, no shifting of weight from foot to foot. It just glided, like it was floating inches above the ground, completely smooth, completely silent. No footsteps, no rustling of clothes, nothing. I raised my flashlight to get a better look, but I only caught the upper part of its body, these impossibly wide shoulders and a long frame. It was moving toward my fifth-wheel camper that I kept parked by the side of the house. I'm not ashamed to admit I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong. This wasn't a person. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. After a few seconds, I snapped out of it and started moving again, but cautiously. The thing slipped behind my camper out of sight. I circled around, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. Though my heart was pounding so loud, I thought it might hear that. When I got around the camper, I spotted it again. The same silhouette, now near the tree line where my driveway loops around. It was moving toward the woods by the small church. I remember thinking, that's not possible, because it had covered too much ground too quickly. Then it stopped, and it turned toward me. I'll never forget what I saw. In the faint light, its eyes caught the beam of my flashlight and glowed, not reflected like an animal's eyes, but glowed green from within. They were set in this conical-shaped head that didn't look human at all. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. Then, in 3 more smooth, silent steps, it reached the woods and just disappeared. No sound of branches breaking, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like it phased through the trees. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. But something in me, maybe stupidity, maybe curiosity, made me run back to the house to grab my rifle. I'm an experienced hunter, and I know those woods well. If there was something out there, I wanted to know what it was. I went back outside, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. I swept the tree line where I'd seen it disappear. Nothing. I gathered my courage and walked to the edge of the woods, shining my light between the trees. The forest floor there is thick with undergrowth, fallen branches, dead leaves, thorny vines. It's impossible to move through it without making noise. I know because I've tried many times while hunting. But whatever this thing was, it had moved through there without disturbing a single leaf. I searched for tracks, but found nothing. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept my rifle by my bed and my eyes on the window. The next morning, I called my buddy Mike to come over. I needed someone else to see what I saw, to validate that I wasn't losing my mind. When Mike arrived, I showed him where I'd seen the thing. We measured the height of my 5th-wheel camper and estimated that whatever I saw had to be between 7.5 to 8 feet tall, based on how it had passed by. Its torso was massive, nearly 2 feet front to back, which is much bigger than even the largest person I've ever seen. Mike suggested it might have been a bear standing on its hind legs, but I shut that down quick. I've seen plenty of bears in my time living out here. They don't move like that, silent and smooth. They're noisy, they shuffle, they breathe heavy. And they certainly don't have glowing green eyes or conical heads. The weeks after that incident were tense. I installed more motion lights around my property. I started locking doors that I'd previously left unlocked. I found myself staying up late, watching the tree line from my window, but I never saw it again. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that night. Was it some kind of wildlife I'd never encountered before? A person in some strange costume? A hallucination? None of those explanations fit what I experienced. The thing that gets me the most is the silence. North Carolina. Forests aren't quiet places to move through. They're full of dry leaves, brittle twigs, thorny underbrush. Even the most careful human would make noise moving through them. But this thing didn't make a sound. Not a single sound. Sometimes I tried to convince myself it didn't happen, that maybe I was tired or the shadows played tricks on my eyes. But then I remember those eyes looking back at me, that intelligent, aware gaze that knew I was watching it. And I know what I saw was real. I've researched local folklore since then, trying to find anything similar to what I experienced. The Cherokee have stories of forest spirits and strange creatures, but nothing that perfectly matches what I saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, but this wasn't a bulky, hairy creature. This was something leaner, smoother, almost elegant in its movements. The property had been in my family for generations, and I'd never heard stories of anything unusual happening there before. My grandfather used to tell ghost stories around the campfire, but they were always about haunted houses in town or the old Civil War battlefields, never about anything in our woods. I still live in North Carolina, but I moved closer to town after that year. I told everyone it was because I wanted a shorter commute to work, but the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was outside after dark on that property. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was dangerous or just passing through. I don't know if it was something natural or something else. But I know it was real, and I know it changed how I see the world. The rational, academic part of my brain still tries to find explanations. Maybe it was a person on stilts, though that doesn't explain the silence or the eyes. Maybe it was some undiscovered species, though in well-explored North Carolina, that seems unlikely. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by shadows and moonlight, though that doesn't explain the distinct movement I saw. But deep down, I know what I saw that night wasn't something that fits neatly into our understanding of the world. It was something other, something that shouldn't exist, but does. I still go camping. I still hike in the woods. I still consider myself a rational person who looks for logical explanations. But now, when I'm in the forest and the sun starts to set, I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, and I always make sure I'm out of the woods before full dark, because whatever was in those woods that night, whatever looked at me with those glowing green eyes, I'm not eager to meet it again. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the house is quiet, I swear I can feel it out there somewhere, moving silently through the darkness, watching and waiting. Story 3. I've been going to Evergreen Lake since I was a kid. It's about 20 miles outside of Randall, Washington, where I grew up. My dad used to take me fishing there almost every weekend during the summer, so I know that place like the back of my hand. I know what deer sound like when they move through the underbrush. I know the difference between a raccoon rustling around and a black bear. I've heard coyotes, owls, elk, you name it. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily in the woods, but what happened over 2 consecutive summers has me questioning everything I thought I knew about those woods. The first incident was during the summer of 2019. Dad and I were fishing in this little secluded cove on the east side of the lake. It was a spot we'd been to hundreds of times before, kind of hidden away from the main areas where tourists hang out. We'd been there since around 6 in the morning, and it was probably close to 11 when it happened. Dad was totally focused on his fishing line. He'd just switched to a new lure and was convinced he was going to catch the big one that had supposedly eluded him for years. I was getting bored, honestly. I'd already caught 2 decent-sized trout and was just kind of zoning out, watching the water. That's when I heard it, rustling in the woods beyond the tree line. Not the light kind of rustling that a squirrel or even a deer might make, but heavier, deliberate, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I turned my head, thinking I'd spot a deer, or maybe even an elk moving through the trees. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. About 40 yards away, something tall moved quickly through a break in the forest. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, there was definitely something there. Something walking upright, on 2 legs. It was big. I'd estimate between 6 and 7 feet tall. I only caught it from the side as it moved between the trees, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. It wasn't a person. The movement was too fluid, too fast for its size. Its arms were unusually long, swinging in a way that seemed not right. My first thought was bear, because what else could it be? But this thing had no visible ears that I could see, no snout. The hair covering its body was this weird mottled color, like dark brown mixed with lighter patches. And the way it moved. Bears can stand on their hind legs, sure, but they don't walk that way with that kind of purpose and speed. I couldn't see its legs clearly through the underbrush, but I was transfixed, trying desperately to make out the details of its face before it disappeared deeper into the forest. It never turned toward me. It just moved with purpose, like it had somewhere to be, and then it was gone. The whole sighting probably lasted less than 10 seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Dad," I said, my voice coming out embarrassingly weak. "Dad, I just saw something in the woods." He barely looked up from his fishing rod. "Probably just a deer, Lucas." "No, it was walking on 2 legs. It was huge." That got his attention, but not in the way I hoped. He smirked and said, "What, you think you saw Bigfoot or something? Come on, son." He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he chuckled and went right back to fishing that he thought I was either making it up out of boredom or had mistaken a shadow for something more. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a person hiking through the woods. I didn't say anything else about it that day. We fished for another hour or so, but I couldn't focus. I kept staring at that spot in the trees, hoping and dreading in equal measure that the creature would return. It didn't. On the drive home, Dad asked me if I wanted to stop for ice cream, his way of making up for dismissing my wild story. I said yes, but the whole time at the ice cream shop, all I could think about was what I'd seen. I started researching as soon as I got home, looking up bears, known wildlife in the area, even reports of unusual sightings around Evergreen Lake. Nothing matched what I'd seen. Fast forward to the following summer, August 2020. I was 19 by then and had convinced a couple friends to go fishing with me at the lake. I didn't tell them about what happened the previous year. I mean, how could I without sounding crazy? But I did make sure we went to the same cove. Part of me hoped I'd see it again. Part of me hoped I wouldn't. Most of me just wanted confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. We took a small aluminum boat out and anchored it about 30 feet from the shore, right across from where I'd seen the creature the year before. My friends, Tyler and Jason, were more interested in drinking the beers they'd smuggled along than actual fishing, but that was fine with me. It meant I could focus on the tree line without them asking questions. We'd been there maybe an hour when I heard it. Heavy movement through the woods. Not just rustling this. Time, but loud, thumping footsteps and the sharp crack of branches breaking. Tyler and Jason didn't seem to notice, talking loudly about some girl from school, but my whole body went rigid. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Tyler said, cracking open another beer. "That noise in the woods, like something big moving around." Jason squinted toward the shore. "Probably just a deer or something, man. Chill." I nodded but kept my eyes fixed on the tree line. Nothing emerged, but the sounds continued intermittently for about 10 minutes before stopping altogether. Then, about 30 minutes later, it started. The squealing, high-pitched, almost screeching sounds coming from deep in the forest. It's hard to describe exactly what it sounded like, kind of like a mix between a hawk's cry and something, I don't know, almost human, but not quite. The sounds echoed across the water, sometimes seeming close, sometimes far away, as if two creatures were calling to each other. This time, Tyler and Jason definitely heard it. "What the hell is that?" Tyler said, setting his beer down. "Sounds like some kind of bird," Jason offered, but I could tell by his expression that he didn't believe his own explanation. The calls continued for almost 20 minutes. They had a pattern to them, almost conversational. One would call out, pause, then another would respond from a different direction. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes there was a long silence before they started again. "Maybe it's elk," Jason said after a particularly long and eerie wail. "I've heard they make weird noises during mating season. I've heard elk before. My uncle takes me hunting every fall. These weren't elk calls. The tone was wrong, the pattern was wrong, everything about it was wrong. And the way they seemed to be communicating with each other, it was unnatural. We stayed in that boat for another hour, none of us fishing anymore, all of us just listening. The calls eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. When we finally headed back to shore, I noticed that Tyler and Jason were paddling faster than necessary, eager to get back to the car. No one mentioned the sounds again that day. It was like we had this unspoken agreement not to acknowledge how freaked out we all were. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, especially when I connected it to what I'd seen the year before. The upright creature with the long arms and no visible ears, the heavy footsteps, the strange communicative calls. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read about known wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. I've listened to recordings of every animal that lives in those woods. Nothing matches what I experienced. There's only one explanation that makes any sense, as crazy as it sounds. Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it. I know how that sounds, believe me. If someone had told me this story 3 years ago, I'd have laughed in their face. But when you've seen something with your own eyes, when you've heard those sounds with your own ears, it changes you. I've been back to Evergreen Lake a few times since then, always to that same cove, always watching the tree line. I haven't seen or heard anything unusual again. Part of me is relieved, but another part is disappointed. I want proof. I want to know for sure that I'm not crazy. I haven't told many people about this. My dad still thinks I imagined the whole thing. Tyler and Jason never bring up that day on the lake. I think they'd rather pretend it never happened. My mom just gives me this worried look whenever I try to talk about it, like she thinks I need therapy or something. So I keep it to myself mostly. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I can't help but wonder how many other people have had similar experiences in those woods, and like me, have kept quiet for fear of being ridiculed. Sometimes I lie, awake at night, replaying that brief sighting in my mind, trying to remember more details, the way it moved, the coloration of its hair, the long, swinging arms. I wonder if it saw me too. I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests around Evergreen Lake, occasionally letting out those eerie calls that still haunt my dreams. I'm going back next summer, alone this time, with a camera. I need to know for sure. Until then, I'll keep searching for answers, keep looking for similar accounts, because the thing is, once you've seen something like that, something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught, you can't just forget it and move on. It becomes a part of you, a mystery you need to solve. So if anyone else has had strange experiences around Evergreen Lake or anywhere in the forests near Randall, Washington, please reach out. Because right now, I feel pretty alone with this. And the more I think about those long arms swinging, that fluid movement through the trees, those communicative calls echoing across the water, the more convinced I become that whatever's out there, it's not just some undiscovered animal. It's something else entirely. Story 4. I've never been able to fully shake what happened that August night in '73. John and I were in our early 20s, full of that stupid invincibility young people have before life knocks it out of them. We'd been dating about 8 months, and this camping trip to the Sierras was meant to be this amazing adventure. We were pretty experienced campers, or at least we thought we were. We arrived at the Sierra Nevada mountains in the afternoon. It was gorgeous, all pine-scented air and massive granite slopes. We found this perfect little spot on a granite outcrop near the timberline. It was slightly elevated with an incredible view, and it felt secluded enough to be romantic without being completely isolated from civilization. I remember being so excited as we set up our little camp, laying out our sleeping bags in the tent, arranging our cooking gear. It was still light out, that golden late afternoon sun making everything look like a postcard. Once we'd finished setting up, John decided we needed firewood for the night. "I'll go gather some before it gets dark," he said, grabbing our hatchet. "You get the fire pit ready." I nodded, thinking nothing of it. This was normal camping stuff. I watched him walk off into the trees, his tall frame disappearing among the pines. I had no idea that would be the beginning of the most terrifying night of my life. The sun was starting to set, and I'd arranged a nice fire pit with some kindling ready to go. I was sitting on a rock, just enjoying the view and waiting for John to return when I first felt it. It's hard to describe. Like that feeling when you know someone's watching you. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the warm evening. I looked around, but saw nothing unusual. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not John's familiar gait, but something stealthy, deliberate. It was moving through the underbrush, just beyond where the light faded. I called out, "John!" My voice sounded small in the vastness. No answer. The footsteps continued, and I realized with growing horror that whatever it was seemed to be circling our campsite. just pacing around the perimeter, staying just beyond where my eyes could penetrate the growing darkness. Every few seconds there'd be the snap of a twig or the rustle of pine needles. Then I heard the breathing, this low, guttural sound that was definitely not human, not like any animal I recognized either. My heart started hammering in my chest. Where the hell was John? He should have been back by now. I called his name again, louder this time. Still nothing, just those footsteps, continuing their methodical circle around me. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared out of my mind. I grabbed a branch from the kindling pile, lit it in the fire I'd managed to start, and held it out like a torch. The flame cast weird, dancing shadows that only made things worse. I could swear I saw movement just beyond the light, but whenever I'd focus on a spot, there'd be nothing there. After what felt like forever, but was probably 15 minutes, John finally returned with an armload of wood. I practically threw myself at him, babbling about something stalking around our camp. "Whoa, Shannon, slow down," he said, dropping the wood. "What's going on?" I explained what I'd heard, and he frowned, looking around into the darkness. "Probably just a deer or something," he said, but I could tell he was uneasy too. "Animals are curious." "This wasn't a deer, John," I insisted. "It was too deliberate. And the breathing." I shivered despite the warmth of the fire. John tried to reassure me, but I noticed he built the fire up bigger than we normally would. We made dinner in tense silence, both of us constantly glancing into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. The sounds had stopped when John returned, which somehow made it worse, like whatever it was had retreated but was still watching. Around 8 o'clock, we noticed headlights coming up the mountain road. A van pulled into a spot about 50 yards from us, and a group of 4 people got out, 2 couples from what we could see. They waved to us, and we waved back, feeling a little better not being completely alone out there. As the night went on, John convinced me I'd just spooked myself. We stayed up by the fire for a while, talking in low voices, trying to recapture that romantic camping vibe. By 11, we were exhausted and decided to turn in. I insisted we keep a flashlight and John's hunting knife within reach inside the tent. He didn't argue. I don't know how long we'd been asleep when it happened. It was the dead of night, that pitch black time when everything is silent. The sound that woke us was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was a roar, but calling it that doesn't do it justice. It was primal, powerful, echoing off the granite slopes around us, like an elephant mixed with a lion, but bigger, angrier. It made my entire body go cold. John bolted upright beside me. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before I could answer, we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, powerful footsteps that literally made the granite beneath our tent vibrate. Whatever was making those footsteps was big, much bigger than a person, and it was walking on 2 feet. The rhythm was unmistakably bipedal. The footsteps were coming closer, accompanied by that horrible breathing I'd heard earlier, now louder, more aggressive. I started shaking uncontrollably. John was frozen beside me, clutching the hunting knife so hard his knuckles were white in the beam of our flashlight. We heard commotion from the other campsite, panicked voices, car doors slamming. The van's engine roared to life, and we saw headlights cutting through the trees as they sped away down the mountain road. They'd just abandoned their entire campsite. That's when I truly realized how much danger we were in. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If we try to run to the car now, we'll run right into it," John whispered back. He was right. The sounds were coming from the direction of where we'd parked. The footsteps continued, getting closer. We could hear rocks rolling down the mountainside, timber snapping. Then came a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I was literally biting my hand to keep from screaming. John was breathing in short, panicked gasps beside me. The thing, whatever it was, reached the road opposite our camp. We could hear it moving around down there, and then there was this awful cracking sound, like wood being twisted and broken, the sound of vegetation being destroyed. I thought I was going to pass out. from fear, and then salvation. Headlights appeared on the road, some random car making its way up the mountain in the middle of the night. The engine sound seemed to startle the creature. There was a pause, and then the most chilling thing of all, the sound of it running uphill, away from the road. Each footstep made the ground shake. It was roaring as it went, not in fear but in rage, like it was furious at being interrupted. The car passed by, oblivious to what was happening, its headlights briefly illuminating our terrified faces through the tent fabric. The sounds of the creature faded as it moved farther up the mountain, but we didn't dare move. We sat there, clutching each other, until the first light of dawn started to filter through the trees. When we finally worked up the courage to emerge from our tent, the morning seemed obscenely normal. Birds were singing, the sun was shining. If it weren't for our shared experience, I might have convinced myself it was all a nightmare. But then we went down to the road, and I saw it. A young pine tree that had been standing the day before, a healthy tree, maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, had been snapped off about 4 feet from the roots. Not cut, not uprooted, snapped, like someone had just broken it with their bare hands. The top part was nowhere to be seen. We packed up faster than we'd ever packed in our lives and got the hell out of there. We barely spoke on the drive home, both trying to process what we'd experienced. John and I broke up about 2 months later. We never really talked about that night again, but I know it changed something between us. How do you go back to normal after something like that? Years later, around 89, I worked up the courage to tell my story to a researcher who specialized in Bigfoot sightings. He listened without judgment and then told me something that made my blood run cold all over again. He said that female menstrual cycles can attract these creatures, that they can smell it from miles away and are drawn to it. I hadn't told him, but I had been on my period that weekend in the Sierras. To this day, I still wake up sometimes hearing those footsteps, that breathing, that roar. I've never gone camping again, and I never will. Some experiences change you forever, leave you with questions that have no answers. What was stalking us that night? What would have happened if that car hadn't come by when it did? I don't know. But sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I swear I can feel the ground vibrating beneath me, like something massive is walking nearby, just waiting for its chance. Story 5. I've been hesitant to share this experience for a long time. Even after all these years, I still get goosebumps thinking about that August day in 1977. I was 23 back then, and had been fishing the high country around the Uintas since I was a kid. I knew those mountains like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did until that day. Me and my buddy Larry had taken 6 younger guys from our church group up to the area between Pass Lake and Cooperant Basin. Beautiful country up there, remote, pristine, about 12,000 feet elevation. The kind of place where you feel like you're the only people for miles. We'd promised the boys' parents we'd teach them some wilderness skills, maybe catch some trout for dinner. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and we'd hiked up to this ridge that gives you an amazing view of this small alpine lake below. The sky was that perfect deep blue you only get at high altitude, not a cloud in sight. We were all catching our breath, drinking some water, when I spotted something moving near the lake. "Hey, check that out," I said, pointing. "Probably an elk." At first, that's honestly what I thought it was, just another elk. I'd seen hundreds of them up there over the years, but something felt off about this. It was big, even for an elk, and its movements seemed different. One of the younger boys, Tyler I think, got excited and accidentally kicked some loose rocks. They went tumbling down the slope, making a racket that echoed across the basin. That's when everything changed. The elk suddenly stopped and turned toward us. I can't explain the feeling that went through me in that moment. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Larry was next to me, binoculars halfway to his face. "What are we looking at?" he whispered, voice shaking. The creature stood up, not like an elk standing from lying down. It stood up on two legs. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been 10 feet tall. 10 feet tall. It was massive, with these incredibly broad shoulders and a build that made the biggest linebacker look tiny. I remember Larry's binoculars dropping to his chest as his hands went limp. The boys behind us started whispering frantically. One of them was hyperventilating. "Everyone stay completely still," I said as quietly as I could. My mouth had gone completely dry. The thing was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but hair, whitish or light grey across its back and upper body, with darker coloration on its lower half. The contrast was striking against the green meadow grasses. It didn't look like a costume or anything fake. The hair moved naturally with the breeze. After it spotted us, it started walking away, on 2 feet, just like a person, but with this smooth, powerful gait that no human could replicate. It moved with purpose, not running, but covering ground quickly. Every few steps it would turn its head to look back at us, like it was making sure we weren't following. We were probably half a mile away, too far to make out facial details clearly, but I could see the outline of its head, conical shape, no distinct neck, just this massive head that seemed to sit directly on those enormous shoulders. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 4 minutes, we watched this thing walk through scattered trees toward the denser forest. None of us spoke. None of us moved. I remember hearing one of the boys quietly crying behind me. The only other sound was the wind. Then it disappeared into the trees. For a long moment, we all just stood there, frozen. Then everyone started talking at once. "Did you see that? What the hell was that thing? I want to go home. Was that a bear? That couldn't be a bear." Larry looked at me, his face pale. "Jay, that was no bear. That was no animal I've ever seen." I'd spent my whole life in these mountains. I'd seen every animal that was supposed to be out here. This wasn't any of them. "Maybe we should check it out," I said, not entirely believing my own words. Part of me was terrified, but another part was intensely curious. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot my whole life. Who hasn't? But I'd always written them off as campfire tales. Most of the boys immediately protested, but a couple of the older ones, plus Larry, agreed to go with me. We made the others promise to stay put on the ridge where we could see them. It took us about 20 minutes to work our way down to where we'd seen the creature. The whole time, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Every crack of a twig made me jump. By the time we reached the edge of the timber where it had disappeared, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. That's when we found the handprints. There's no other way to describe them. They were handprints, but enormous. On some rocks and patches of dry ground, we found these distinct impressions that looked exactly like a hand had pressed down, but the palm alone was bigger than my entire hand. You could clearly see the outline of a palm and fingers. I put my hand in one of the impressions for comparison, and it was dwarfed. We found some tracks too, but the ground was too dry to hold clear footprints. Just some depressions and broken vegetation that showed something heavy had moved through. We followed these signs to the edge of the forest, but stopped there. The dense trees suddenly seemed menacing, like anything could be watching us from just a few feet away. "I don't think we should go in there," Larry said, voicing what we were all thinking. We took a few photos with the disposable camera I had, though I doubted the handprints would show up clearly. I wish we'd had better equipment. When we got back to the others, they were desperate to leave, but it was already late afternoon. Going down the mountain in the dark would be dangerous. We had to make camp. None of us wanted to stay anywhere near where we'd seen the creature, so we hiked about 2 miles to Fish Lake. We set up a makeshift camp, but I don't think anyone slept that night. We kept the fire blazing, bigger than was necessary, and took turns keeping watch. Every sound in the darkness made us all tense up. I remember sitting there, staring into the trees, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. I kept thinking I saw movement just beyond the firelight. The boys were terrified, huddled together in their sleeping bags, some of them quietly crying. "What if it comes back?" one of them asked me around midnight. I didn't have an answer that would comfort him. The truth was, I was terrified too. At first light, we packed up faster than I've ever broken camp in my life and headed down the mountain. Nobody complained about being tired or hungry. We just wanted out of there. On the way down, we passed a cattle herder who had his operation set up below Gold Hills. He must have noticed how spooked we all looked, because he asked if everything was all right. When Larry hesitantly mentioned what we'd seen, expecting ridicule, the herder's expression changed. "That explains it," he said quietly. "My cattle won't stay up in that basin this summer. Every time I drive them up there, they come running back to camp, spooked out of their minds. Been herding in these mountains for 20 years, never seen them act like this." He told us something else that made my skin crawl. This was the first summer he hadn't seen or heard a single coyote in the area. Not one. It was like all the predators had abandoned the territory. We finally made it back to our vehicles around noon, exhausted and still shaken. The parents were waiting, concerned because we were hours later than planned. We didn't tell them what happened, just made up some story about getting a late start that morning. On the drive home, Larry and I agreed not to talk about what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. But privately, I knew what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else. I've been back to the Uintas many times since then, but never to that specific basin. I just can't bring myself to go there. Sometimes when I'm fishing alone in the high country, I'll feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, like I'm being watched. I'll scan the tree line, half expecting to see that massive figure standing there watching me. I still can't explain what we saw that day. All I know is that it changed how I see the wilderness. Those mountains I thought I knew so well, turns out they were keeping secrets from me all along. Story 6. I've been going over what happened for a month now, and I still can't make sense of it. I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I'm not crazy or prone to making up stories. I've been hunting in northern Michigan for over 25 years, and I know what I saw that day wasn't normal. It was mid-October 1990, the start of bow season. I'd taken a week off work to hit my usual hunting spot near the Huron National Forest. The weather was perfect, cool but not freezing, with that crisp fall smell in the air. I'd been scouting the area earlier in the season and had my favorite tree stand all set up in a mature oak about 15 feet up, overlooking a small clearing where I'd seen deer activity. That evening, I headed out around 4 o'clock. Anyone who hunts knows that golden hour before sunset is prime time. I was settled in my stand by 4:30, my compound bow hanging on the hook beside me, just waiting. I remember checking my watch at 5:15 and thinking I had about an hour of good light left. I've always loved that quiet time in the stand, just you and the woods, everything getting still as the day winds down. I'd been hunting since I was 12, following my dad around these same woods. He passed 5 years ago, but I still use his old knife to field dress deer. Sorry, getting off track here. So I'm sitting there, barely moving, just scanning the tree line and listening. That's when I got that feeling. You know that sensation when you're being watched? The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to look to my left. About 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a large maple, was something. At first I thought it was a bear cub, but the coloring was off. This greenish-gray-black fur that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen in these woods. It was standing upright, about 5 feet tall, which would be big for a cub anyway. I froze. Didn't even reach for my binoculars at first, just stared. The thing was peeking around the tree like a kid playing hide-and-seek. Only its head, one shoulder, and part of its torso were visible. And it was looking right at me. Now, I've had plenty of wildlife encounters over the years. Startled bears, curious raccoons, even had a bobcat stare me down once. Animals either bolt when they see you, or if they're predators, they give you this cold assessment. This was different. This thing was studying me, like it understood exactly what I was doing up in that tree. After about a minute of this standoff, I slowly reached for my binoculars. My hands were shaking a bit, which never happens. I'm usually dead steady on a shot. When I got the creature in focus, that's when the real chill hit me. Its face wasn't like any animal I knew. The eyes were black, no visible whites, and set in a face that was, Christ, it's hard to even say it, almost human-like, but covered in that strange fur. No snout like a bear or coyote would have. The mouth was small, kind of like a chimp's, but with this expression that I can only describe as a smirk, like it was amused by the whole situation. That's what got me the most, that expression. Animals don't smile, they don't smirk, but this thing had what I can only call a mischievous little grin, like it was playing a game with me. I lowered the binoculars and reached for my bow, not because I planned to shoot it, I had no idea what the hell I was looking at, but because I suddenly felt vulnerable. As I moved, it didn't startle or run. It just adjusted its position slightly, keeping its hands on the tree trunk, fingers splayed out. The hands looked wrong too long, too articulated for a bear or any other animal I could think of. The smell hit me then. Not overpowering, but distinctive. Not the musky stink of a bear or the heavy scent of deer. Something different. Kind of musty and strange, like wet clothes left too long in a washing machine, but with something else I couldn't place. Not necessarily foul, just completely unfamiliar. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Me in my stand, barely breathing, and this thing just watching me from behind its tree. I checked my watch later. It was 15 minutes. 15 minutes of the most intense, unnerving eye contact I've ever experienced. Then it made a sound, not a growl or a howl, but this low, forced exhale, almost like a deer's warning snort, but deeper, more deliberate, like it was trying to communicate something. The sound broke the spell, and I realized my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What happened next has been replaying in my mind ever since. The creature stepped fully out from behind the tree, and I got my first complete look at it. It was bipedal, standing completely upright on two legs, no hunching like a bear would do. It turned and walked away, not on all fours, not in the awkward waddle of a bear on hind legs, but in a smooth, deliberate gait that was disturbingly human-like. It moved deeper into the trees, occasionally glancing back at me until I couldn't see it anymore. I sat there frozen for another 20 minutes, bow in hand, straining to hear or see any sign of it returning. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That silence was almost as unnerving as the encounter itself. When I finally worked up the nerve to climb down, it was almost dark. I've never packed up my gear so quickly. I practically jogged back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't even unstring my bow until I was safely inside the cab with the doors locked. That night at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange or some other condition that altered its appearance. Maybe it was someone in a ghillie suit playing a prank, though who would be stupid enough to mess with a hunter in the woods is beyond me. Neither explanation felt right. The next morning I went back. I know, probably stupid, but I had to see if there was any evidence. In the daylight, with my hunting knife on my belt and my .45 on my hip instead of just my bow, I felt a little braver. I found the maple tree where it had been standing and searched the area for tracks, hair, anything. The ground was covered in leaves, but in a few bare patches I found nothing. No prints, no scat, no signs of anything unusual. It was like it had never been there. I decided to set up in the same stand again that evening. Call it curiosity or stubbornness, but I needed to know if it would come back. I sat from 3 in the afternoon until last light, tense and hyper-alert the whole time. Nothing appeared. The woods seemed normal again. Squirrels chattering, birds calling, even had a doe and her fawn pass through around 6. But no sign of my watcher. I stayed 3 more days, hunting different areas but returning to that same stand each evening. Never saw the creature again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one being hunted, or at least observed. It's been a month now, and I still don't have answers. I've hunted these woods my entire life and never seen anything like it. I've looked through wildlife guides, searched for reports of unusual animals in the area, even reluctantly thumbed through a book on cryptids my nephew left at my house. Nothing matches exactly what I saw. What keeps me up at night isn't just what it was, but the way it behaved. That deliberate hiding, that studying gaze, that unsettling smile. Animals don't act like that. They don't play psychological games. They don't smile at you from behind trees. I'm going back to the same spot next season. I've already requested the time off. I'll be better prepared. Camera, better binoculars, maybe even a small recorder. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to know if it's still out there, still watching. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows something happened. She said I came back from that trip different, but I haven't given her the details. How do you tell someone you love that you saw something that shouldn't exist? That the woods you've always felt at home in suddenly feel alien and watching? So that's my story. I'm not claiming it was a Bigfoot or an alien or anything specific. I'm just a guy who spent his life in the woods and saw something I can't explain. I still hunt, still love being outdoors, but I'm different now. More alert, more aware that maybe we don't know everything that's out there in the dark spaces between the trees. And sometimes, when I'm in my stand and the woods go suddenly quiet, I get that feeling again, that prickling awareness of being watched. And I find myself scanning the trees, looking for a pair of dark eyes and that unsettling, knowing smile. Story 7. I don't usually talk about this. For a long time, I kept quiet because I didn't want people thinking I was crazy or making stuff up. Hell, if someone told me this story, I probably wouldn't believe them either. But it's been 12 years now, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. Maybe writing it down will help. I don't know. This happened in January 2012. I was working security at Fort Leavenworth after finishing my military service. I'd done 5 tours between Iraq and Afghanistan. Seen some shit, you know. IEDs, firefights, the works. Got wounded twice. Thought nothing could really shake me anymore. I was wrong. I was stationed at this perimeter checkpoint about half a mile from the Missouri River. It was basically a concrete box with reinforced walls and a heavy steel blast door. The kind of place designed to withstand an attack. My partner that night was Derek, another ex-military guy. We'd been on the same shift rotation for about 6 months by then. It was around midnight, and we were in the middle of this nasty snowstorm. The wind was howling, temperature well below freezing. We were bored out of our minds, just watching the monitors, doing equipment checks. Nothing ever happened at this post. That was the whole point of taking the job after getting out. No more adrenaline, no more fighting, just easy money. Derek was getting antsy and said he needed a smoke. I told him he was crazy to go outside in that weather, but he just laughed and grabbed his coat. "Be back in 5, he said. Standard procedure was to lock the door behind him, protocol and all that. I went back to the monitors, not really paying attention. Not even a minute later, there was banging on the door. Not just knocking, banging, like someone hitting it with their whole body. I thought maybe Derek slipped on ice or something. When I opened the viewing slot, Derek's face was right there, pressed against it. His eyes were wide, and his face was pale white. I'd never seen him look like that, not even when we talked about our combat experiences. "Let me the fuck in now," he hissed through clenched teeth. I unlocked the door immediately, and he practically fell inside. He slammed it shut behind him and locked it, breathing hard. "What the hell happened?" I asked. He was shaking, actually shaking. "There's something out there, Jack. Not a person. Not an animal either. I don't know what the fuck it is." I thought he was messing with me at first. Derek wasn't the type to get spooked. This was a guy who'd been in serious combat situations and handled them with composure. "What do you mean, like a bear?" I asked. We occasionally had wildlife in the area, though rarely in winter. "No, no way. It's bigger, and it's standing upright." He was still pressed against the door, like he was making sure it stayed closed. I went to the monitors. Our security cameras covered the approach to the checkpoint and parts of the perimeter fence, but visibility was poor with all the snow. I couldn't see anything unusual. "I'm going to take a look," I said, grabbing my coat and flashlight. Derek grabbed my arm. "Don't go out there alone. I'm serious." I could tell he wasn't joking around. So we both geared up, heavy coats, gloves, and I grabbed the shotgun we kept for emergencies. Technically, we weren't supposed to use it unless there was an active threat, but something about Derek's reaction had me on edge. We stepped outside together. The snow was coming down hard, and the wind cut right through my coat. We stood there for a moment listening. At first, all I could hear was the wind. Then I heard it, something moving in the tree. A line about 100 feet away. Heavy footsteps, breaking branches. Whatever it was big. Really big. "That's where I saw it," Derek whispered, "standing at the edge of the trees." I raised the flashlight, pointing it toward the sounds, but the beam didn't reach far enough through the heavy snow. We took a few steps forward, and that's when it happened. This roar. No, more like a scream. But not human, not animal either. It was loud enough that I felt it in my chest, like standing next to artillery fire. It started low and then went higher, ending in this piercing shriek that made my ears ring. I've heard all kinds of sounds in combat: gunfire, explosions, wounded men screaming. Nothing compared to this, nothing. Derek and I didn't even look at each other. We just turned and ran back to the checkpoint. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life. We got inside, slammed the door shut, and locked every mechanism on it. "What the fuck was that?" I said, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Derek just shook his head. He was pale as a ghost. "I told you, not a man, not an animal." We barely had time to catch our breath when the banging started. Not on the door at first. It sounded like it was circling the building, like it was testing the walls. Concrete walls, mind you, reinforced. The whole structure seemed to vibrate. Then it came to the door. The first hit made both of us jump. It was like someone taking a battering ram to it. Boom! Then again, boom! The door, a solid steel security door designed to withstand explosives, actually flexed inward with each impact. "Jesus Christ," Derek whispered. I went to the monitors. We had one camera positioned above the door, pointing down. I could only see the top of whatever it was. Just the crown of what looked like a head, covered in dark fur or hair, pressing against the building as it pounded on our door. The banging continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Each impact was harder than the last. I was genuinely worried the door might give way. These doors were designed to stop terrorists with explosives, not whatever this was. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence, except for our breathing and the howling wind outside. We stayed frozen, waiting. 1 minute passed. 2, 5. "Is it gone?" Derek finally asked. I checked all the monitors. Nothing, no movement anywhere. "I'm going to check the exterior cameras," I said, switching feeds to our perimeter views. Still nothing visible. We waited another 20 minutes before either of us dared to move away from the monitors. My hands were still shaking. "We need to report this," I said. Derek looked at me. "And say what? That Bigfoot attacked our post. They'll drug test us and then fire us." He had a point. But I needed to see what was outside. I needed to know if there was evidence, something tangible to prove we weren't just hallucinating. "We need to look outside," I said. "Just a quick check." Derek didn't like it, but he agreed. We armed ourselves again, and I added a sidearm to my shotgun. We opened the door cautiously. both of us ready to slam it shut at the first sign of trouble. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, and there, on the door, were dents, actual dents in hardened steel, spaced out like massive knuckles had pounded on it. I ran my hand over them, feeling the warped metal. "That's not possible," I said, though the evidence was right under my fingers. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. In the fresh snow were footprints, massive footprints. I used my hand to measure one. It was easily 21 inches long. They were clearly defined, 5 toes, a wide ball, and a heel. Humanoid, but impossibly large. We followed the tracks with our flashlights. They led straight to the perimeter fence, a 15-foot-high barrier topped with razor wire. The tracks went right up to it and then appeared on the other side, continuing toward the river. Whatever made them had simply stepped over a 15-foot fence like it was nothing. "We should follow them," I said, not really believing my own words. Derek grabbed my shoulder. "Are you out of your fucking mind? That thing could tear us apart." He was right. Whatever left those tracks was stronger than anything I could imagine. The thought of encountering it again, especially away from our secure position, was terrifying. We went back inside and locked the door. Neither of us slept that night. We sat with our weapons, watching the monitors until our shift ended at 6 in the morning. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? When our relief arrived, we didn't tell them what happened. We just said we had a quiet night and left it at that. The snow had covered most of the tracks by morning anyway, and the dents in the door, well, we had no explanation for those that wouldn't sound insane. Derek and I talked about it later once, over beers. We promised each other we wouldn't tell anyone else. Who would believe us? We'd both seen combat, both been considered reliable and level-headed. We had reputations to protect, but that night changed us both. Derek quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't stand night shifts anymore. I stayed on, but requested a transfer to daytime security inside the main compound. I told them I was having trouble sleeping at night due to PTSD from my tours. It wasn't entirely a lie. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we experienced. Could it have been a bear? No way. Bears don't roar like that, don't stand that tall, and certainly can't dent steel doors or step over 15-foot fences. Some kind of elaborate prank? Who would go to those lengths in a snowstorm at a military installation? A person in a costume couldn't have made those impacts. I've read about Sasquatch sightings along the Missouri River, never believed them before, still don't want to. But whatever was outside our post that night was real. It was massive, it was strong, and it was nothing I can explain. I've been in firefights, I've had bullets miss my head by inches, I've seen friends die and been wounded myself. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in my combat experience prepared me for the sheer terror of that night. It fundamentally changed how I see the world. I still work in security, but I don't take posts near wooded areas anymore. I don't go camping, I don't hike, and I never ever work night shifts. Derek and I lost touch after a while. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, somewhere desert, somewhere with no forests. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, wandering the woods near Fort Leavenworth. I wonder if anyone else has seen it. If they have, they're keeping quiet too. Some things you just can't explain. Some things are better left alone. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt that night. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget it. Story 8. I've debated for years whether to share this. Most people I've told think I'm crazy or was just tired and seeing things, but I know what I saw that morning, and I'm still not over it. This happened back in May of 1999. I was working as a tow truck driver out of Thompson, Manitoba. It was decent work, paid the bills, and kept me busy. That particular morning, I was on my way back to Thompson after helping a stranded motorist about 70 kilometers out. It was on Provincial Road 280, a lonely stretch of highway cutting through dense forest. It was around 5:30 in the morning. The sun was just starting to come up, but the trees made everything darker than it should have been. I'd been on shift for almost 12 hours straight. My eyes were getting heavy, and I kept catching myself nodding off. After the third time my head snapped back up, I knew I needed to pull over before I wrapped my truck around a tree. I found a wide shoulder and pulled completely off the road. I figured I'd just take a 20-minute power nap to get me home safely. I killed the engine, reclined my seat a bit, and closed my eyes. Must have dozed off immediately, because the next thing I remember was jolting awake. What woke me wasn't a dream or my alarm. It was a sound, and I still struggle to describe it accurately. It wasn't quite a growl or a howl, maybe somewhere between a deep moan and a rumbling breath. It seemed to vibrate the air around my truck. At first I thought it might be another vehicle with engine trouble, but I couldn't see headlights through my rearview mirror. The weird thing was, before I even looked out my window, I felt something was wrong. It was like this wave of dread washed over me. My heart started racing and my mouth went dry. I've never felt anything like it before or since. This instinctual, primal fear that something dangerous was nearby. I remember my hands were shaking as I straightened up in my seat. I glanced at my watch, 6:15 a.m. I'd slept longer than planned. The forest around me was quiet now, too quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing, just dead silence. That's when I heard heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots but much heavier, making the gravel crunch on the roadside. I looked out my driver's side window first and saw nothing. But the footsteps seemed to be coming from the passenger side. I hesitated for what felt like forever before slowly turning to look out the passenger window. I'll never forget what I saw standing in the middle of the road. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark, matted hair from head to toe. The hair was a deep brown, almost black, and hung in long strands around its body. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that. This thing was standing on 2 legs, perfectly balanced. Its arms, Jesus, its arms hung down almost to its knees. They were thick, like tree trunks, and ended in what looked like massive hands with fingers, not paws, hands. The face is what still haunts me. It was like an ape, but different. The brow was heavy, jutting out over deep-set eyes. The nose was wide and flat. But the eyes, they were aware. That's the only way I can put it. There was intelligence there. It was staring right at me. We made eye contact, and in that moment, I knew it was seeing me as clearly as I was seeing it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think about starting my truck. I was frozen. Then it turned slightly, still watching me. I'd guess this thing weighed at least 800 or 900 pounds, maybe even 1,000. When it moved, I could see muscles shifting under all that hair. It wasn't lumbering or awkward. It moved with purpose. It started walking toward the tree line on the side of the road. But here's the thing that really got to me. It kept looking back over its shoulder at me, like it was making sure I wasn't following or maybe warning me not to. Each time it looked back, I felt that same wave of terror wash over me. Once it reached the edge of the forest, it gave me one final look. I swear I saw its nostrils flare, like it was taking in my scent. Then it stepped into the brush and disappeared. The way the trees and undergrowth parted for it, you'd think something that size would crash through, but it moved with an eerie kind of grace, like it knew exactly where to step. The moment it was out of sight, the spell broke. I lunged for my keys, fumbling so badly I dropped them between the seats. I was cursing, sweating, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I finally got the engine started, I peeled out of there so fast I nearly fishtailed into the ditch. I must have been doing 120 kilometers down that highway, white-knuckling the steering wheel and constantly checking my mirrors. Every shadow in the trees looked like that thing was following me. About 20 minutes later, my radio crackled. It was my boss, Dave, wondering why I hadn't checked in yet. I tried to sound normal, but my voice was shaking so bad, he immediately knew something was wrong. "Jenkins? What's going on? You sound like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't tell him, not over the radio, not when I was still trying to process it myself. I just said I'd had a scare on the road and would explain when I got back. When I finally pulled into the yard back in Thompson, Dave took one look at me and pulled me into his office. My hands were still trembling and I was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning. "What the hell happened out there, Mike?" he asked, closing the door. So I told him. Everything. The sound that woke me, the feeling of dread, and the massive hair-covered creature that had stared me down on Provincial Road 280. As I was describing it, I realized how insane it all sounded. But Dave didn't laugh or roll his eyes. He just listened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he picked up his phone and called someone named Alex. "Got another one," was all he said before hanging up. Turns out Alex was an RCMP officer who'd been keeping unofficial records of Bigfoot sightings in the area for years. Dave had known him since high school and trusted him not to spread stories around. Alex came by the shop later that day and asked me to go back out there with him to check for tracks or other evidence. No way in hell was I going back there. Not then, not ever. I told him exactly where it happened, described everything in detail, but I refused to go. Alex didn't push it. He just nodded and said he understood. "You're not the first person to see something out there, Michael," he told me. "Provincial Road 280 has a history. The local Cree have stories going back generations about creatures in those woods." He went out there himself, but called later to say the rain had started by the time he arrived, washing away any potential tracks. Part of me was relieved. No, evidence meant no one could pressure me to go public with what I'd seen. The weeks after were rough. I couldn't sleep without seeing those eyes. I'd wake up hearing that sound, that deep, rumbling moan that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Dave took me off the night shifts for a while, which I appreciated. But eventually, I had to get back to normal. I still drive trucks, but I refuse jobs that take me down Provincial Road 280. Dave understands and never questions it. In the 20-plus years since it happened, I've only told a handful of people. Most react exactly how you'd expect, with disbelief or awkward changes of subject. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I used to hunt, used to love camping and fishing deep in the woods. Now I stick to populated campgrounds with plenty of other people around. When I do go into the forest, I'm constantly scanning the trees, listening for that sound again. I carry bear spray, not for bears, but for something I'm not sure it would even work against. I've read up on Bigfoot sightings since then. Some match what I saw, others don't. I don't know if what I encountered was a Sasquatch, a Wendigo, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it let me go. Sometimes I wonder if it was as scared of me as I was of it. Other times, I'm convinced it could have easily flipped my truck if it wanted to. Why didn't it? Was it just curious? Was I in its territory? These questions keep me up at night even now. The forests of Manitoba are vast and largely unexplored. There are places humans rarely go, places where the trees grow so thick they block out the sun. I believe there are things living in those shadows that science hasn't classified, things that have learned to stay hidden from us. I still drive for a living, still pass through remote areas, but now I keep my doors locked, my windows up, and I never, ever pull over to sleep on deserted stretches of road. And if I'm being completely honest, there's always a small part of me that's watching and waiting, wondering if I'll ever see it again. If you're ever driving through northern Manitoba, especially on Provincial Road 280, keep your eyes open and your doors locked. And if you hear a sound you can't quite place, something between a moan and a rumble that seems to vibrate the air around you, don't stop to investigate. Just drive. Drive as fast and as far as you can. Because now you know what I know. We're not alone in those woods. Story 9. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family. It's been over 40 years, but I still think about it almost every week. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington in the 70s, a pretty normal kid who spent most of his time outdoors. My dad taught me and my brother to hunt and fish, basically as soon as we could walk. By the time I was 9, I could identify every animal track in our part of the state, knew what every bird call meant, and could tell you what made that branch snap in the woods without even looking. This isn't me bragging. It's important you understand I knew the difference between a bear, a cougar, and a deer from a quarter mile away. That's why what happened that summer evening in '77 still haunts me. I was at my friend Tommy's house in this little neighborhood on the edge of town. His place backed up to this huge stretch of forest that seemed to go on forever. We were just sitting on his front porch, me and my brother Rick, waiting for Tommy to finish dinner so we could go ride bikes. It was getting close to dusk, that weird time when the shadows get long and the light turns golden. The neighborhood was quiet, except for some dogs barking down the street. At first, we didn't think anything of it. Dogs bark, right? But then the barking changed. It wasn't just alert barking anymore. It became this frantic, desperate sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then we saw them, 5, maybe 6 dogs running across lawns on the other side of the street, all barking and snarling at something. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A really tall man, maybe? But no, this thing was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was covered in dark hair, not like a bear's fur, but more like long human hair all over its body. It was running on 2 legs, completely upright, but its arms, God, its arms were what really got to me. They didn't swing naturally like a person's would. They were stiff, held out slightly from its body as it ran. The thing was fast too. The dogs were going crazy trying to keep up with it, but this creature was covering ground in these huge strides. What struck me was that it seemed almost skinny compared to what you think of when someone mentions Bigfoot. Not bulky or massive, but tall and lean, like maybe it was young or something. The whole thing probably lasted less than 30 seconds. It crossed through 3 or 4 yards, then disappeared into the tree line behind the houses. The dogs stopped at the edge of the forest, still barking but not daring to follow. I remember looking at Rick, and his face was completely white. We didn't say anything at first. What could we say? We knew what we'd just seen, but we also knew no one would believe us. When Tommy finally came out, we didn't tell him. We just got on our bikes and rode around the neighborhood. But I kept looking toward the woods, wondering if it was watching us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how it moved, not like a costume, not like a person, not like any animal I'd ever seen. It moved like it belonged in its body, if that makes sense. Like something that evolved to move exactly that way. My dad laughed when we finally told him the next day, said we'd probably seen a bear with mange or a guy in a costume messing with the neighborhood. But he didn't see its eyes. I did. Just for a split second when it turned its head toward the dogs. Those weren't human eyes, and they definitely weren't bear eyes either. I tried to forget about it. For a while, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. Kids see things, right? But then came the second encounter, and there's no way I imagined that one. I was 13, so this would have been in '81. Rick was 15 by then. Dad had finally decided we were old enough to go deer hunting without him, but only if we stayed together. We were up along the North Fork of the Nooksack River, an area we knew well from fishing trips. It was late November, and it had started snowing heavily about an hour into our hunt. The snow was that wet, heavy kind that sticks to everything. Perfect for tracking, which is why we decided to stick it out despite the weather getting worse. We'd been walking along this ridge above the river for maybe 2 miles when Rick stopped suddenly and grabbed my arm. "Connor, look at that," he whispered, pointing down to our left. There in the fresh snow was a line of tracks I'll never forget as long as I live. They looked like bare human footprints, except they were enormous. I mean, easily 15 to 17 inches long. The snow was recording every detail perfectly. 5 toes, the ball of the foot, the heel, everything. These weren't bear tracks. I'd seen hundreds of bear tracks in snow. Bears have 5 toes too, but the shape is completely different. These were unmistakably hominid. What really sent ice through my veins was realizing how fresh they were. The snow was coming down hard, maybe an inch every 20 minutes, but there was almost no accumulation in these prints. Whatever made them had passed through just minutes before we got there. "Should we follow them?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. Rick just nodded. I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. This was connected to what we'd seen 4 years earlier. We followed the tracks for about 200 yards. They led down toward the river, then veered into this really dense section of brush and younger trees. The stride length was incredible, at least 4 feet between steps. I had to practically jump from one print to the next. The snow was getting heavier, and the light was starting to fade. We both had our rifles, but suddenly they felt inadequate. Whatever we were tracking was big, and it was close. I remember the absolute silence around us. No birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing, just the soft hush of snow falling. Then Rick grabbed my shoulder and nodded toward the brush ahead of us. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a section of branches moving slightly, differently than the way the snow was making other branches move. Something was in there, watching us. Neither of us said a word. We just looked at each other, and without speaking, agreed it was time to go. We backed away slowly, then turned and walked as quickly as we could without running back toward the logging road where we'd parked. We never saw what made those tracks, not directly, but I felt it watching us the entire way back. Every few minutes, I'd hear a branch snap somewhere in the woods, always just far enough away that I couldn't see what caused it. But it was following us, keeping pace easily. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in the back and got the hell out of there. We were about 5 miles down the road when Rick finally spoke. "That was the same thing we saw at Tommy's, wasn't it?" I just nodded. What else could it have been? The weirdest part was how we both instinctively knew not to tell Dad the real story. We made up some excuse about the snow getting too heavy and going home early. I think we both understood that some experiences exist outside the normal world, and trying to explain them just diminishes them somehow. It's been over 40 years now. I've spent countless more days in those. Same woods, hunting, fishing, and hiking. I've never seen anything like that again, but I'm always aware, always looking. Every unusual sound makes me freeze and scan the tree line. Every odd shadow in the periphery of my vision makes my heart skip. I've read all the Bigfoot stories and reports over the years. Some sound like what we experienced, others don't. What we saw wasn't the massive, hulking creature from the Patterson film. It was leaner, almost adolescent looking. I've wondered if there are different types, or maybe different ages, just like any other species. I don't have any photos or plaster casts of those tracks. This was long before cell phones, and we were too scared to think about evidence collection. All I have is the memory, but it's as clear today as it was then. The way it moved across those yards with the dogs in pursuit, the impossible stride length of those tracks in the snow, the feeling of being watched by something intelligent that didn't want to be seen. I moved away from Bellingham years ago, but I still go back to visit family. Sometimes I drive out to that old neighborhood or up along the Nooksack. I never tell anyone what I'm really looking for, but I'm always scanning the tree line, always wondering if it's still out there. The forests of the Pacific Northwest hold secrets. I've seen one of them twice. I don't know what to call it, don't know what it really was, but I know what I saw, and 40 years of rationalization haven't changed that. Something lives in those woods that science hasn't classified. Something watches from the trees when we think we're alone. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky or maybe really lucky, you catch a glimpse of it running through your world before disappearing back into its own. Story 10. I've never told many people about this. Even today, more than 40 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about that winter night. My brother Danny and I saw something in our backyard that shouldn't exist, at least according to everything we're taught to believe about the world. It was either late 78 or early 79. I can't remember exactly anymore. I was 10 years old and Danny was 8. We lived outside Oak Ridge, Oregon, in a house that backed up to a pretty dense forest. That winter was brutal. We'd gotten hammered with snowstorm after snowstorm. The snow was piled so high, our dad had to shovel pathways just so we could get to the mailbox. That afternoon, we'd been at our friend Mike's house about half a mile away. Our parents always told us to be home before dark, especially in winter. We left Mike's place when the sun was already getting low, knowing we'd catch hell if we weren't back soon. There was a shortcut through the woods that would save us about 15 minutes. So naturally, that's the way we went. Walking through that snow was exhausting for kids our size. It was easily up to my knees, maybe higher in some spots. We had to lift our legs high with each step, like we were marching in some ridiculous parade. Danny was having an even harder time since he was smaller. I remember we were both sweating despite the cold, our breath coming out in big white clouds. "Tim, wait up," Danny kept calling from behind me. I'd stop every few yards to let him catch up. The sun was almost gone by the time we finally broke through the tree line into our backyard. I was so focused on getting home that it took me a second to notice something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. Standing dead center in our snow-covered backyard was something, a figure. It was just standing there motionless, with its back to us, maybe 30 feet away. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a neighbor? Dad? But I knew instantly it wasn't either of those things. This thing was huge, had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, probably taller. It had a strong, broad build, but with a slight hunch to its shoulders. The entire body was covered in long brown hair or fur, but not like a bear's thick coat. It was more sparse, and I could make out dark skin underneath in places. The hair looked matted and dirty, hanging in clumps. Danny and I froze in place. I instinctively put my arm out to stop him from moving forward. We didn't say a word. I don't think either of us could speak. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might explode. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, staring at its back while it remained completely still. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It was shaped like a person, but definitely wasn't one. My mind kept screaming that this wasn't possible. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided we needed something to defend ourselves. I tried to quietly reach down and pull a stick out from beneath the snow. My fingers were numb from cold, and the stick was frozen in place. When I yanked it free, it made a sharp cracking sound. The thing's head snapped around so fast it didn't seem natural. Its body stayed facing away, but its head turned to look directly at us. That's when I saw its face, and God, I wish I hadn't. It had features that were a disturbing mix of human and ape. Dark, leathery skin stretched over a prominent brow. Its eyes were set deep, but they were aware, intelligent. The nose was flat and wide, and its mouth was a grim line across its face. But the eyes are what I remember most. They were dark, almost black, and they locked onto us with an intensity that felt like being hit with a physical force. We stood there staring at each other for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, though it felt like hours. I couldn't move. It felt like my feet had grown roots into the ground. Danny was trembling beside me. I could feel him shaking against my arm. Then it happened. The creature suddenly spun around to face us completely. In one fluid motion, it turned and started running straight at us through the deep snow. Now, I've seen Olympic athletes. I've watched deer bound through forests. Nothing moves like this thing did. It was taking massive strides through snow that had me struggling to walk, moving as if the snow wasn't even there. Its arms swung powerfully at its sides, and it covered ground with impossible speed. "Run!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. We bolted for the back door, stumbling and tripping through the snow. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. I remember the burning in my lungs from the cold air and the pure terror. Danny was right beside me, crying as we ran. We burst through the back door, slamming it behind us and screaming for our parents. Mom came running from the kitchen looking alarmed. "What on earth is wrong with you two?" she demanded. We were both talking at once, hysterical, pointing toward the yard. "There's a monster outside, a Bigfoot or something," I was shouting. "It was looking at us, it chased us," Danny added, his voice high and cracking. Mom's face changed from concern to irritation. "Boys, that's enough. You know I hate when you make up stories to scare each other." "We're not making it up, it was right there," I insisted, tugging her toward the window. Dad came in then, asking what all the commotion was about. Mom told him we were telling tales again, and he gave us that stern look I knew so well. "Timothy, Daniel, I don't want to hear another word about monsters. You're scaring your brother with this nonsense," he said, pointing at Danny, who was still crying. "But Dad, no buts. Go wash up for dinner." I knew that tone. There was no point arguing. Danny and I looked at each other, both knowing what we'd seen, but realizing no one was going to believe us. Dinner was tense and quiet. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see that face peering in at us. Danny barely touched his food. Our parents attributed our behavior to us being overtired or playing too many games. That night, we were sent to our bedroom as usual. We shared a room on the ground floor that faced the backyard, the same yard where we'd seen the creature. Our window was maybe 5 feet off the ground. Neither of us could sleep. We left the light on and sat on my bed, backs against the wall, staring at the window. The curtains were closed, but that didn't provide much comfort. "What if it comes back?" Danny whispered. "It won't," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Dad would hear it." Around 10:30, when the house had gone quiet and our parents had gone to bed, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching across the snow-covered porch outside. Slow, deliberate steps, much heavier than a person's. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps stopped right outside our window. We could hear breathing now, deep, raspy breaths that fogged the glass. Danny started crying silently, tears streaming down his face. I put my hand over his mouth, terrified that any sound might provoke whatever was out there. For nearly 20 minutes, we sat frozen on that bed, listening to the creature breathing outside our window. Occasionally, there would be a soft thud against the glass, like it was pressing against it, testing its strength. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed Danny's hand and we bolted from the room, running straight to the living room where Dad had fallen asleep watching TV. "Dad! Dad! It's outside our window!" I was shaking him frantically. He startled awake, confused and irritated. "What the hell are you boys doing up?" "There's something outside. Please, Dad, you have to look." Danny was pulling on his arm. Dad grumbled but got up, probably just to prove us wrong and send us back to bed. He walked toward our bedroom, flipping on lights as he went. We followed behind, clutching each other's hands. At our bedroom door, he stopped and listened. The breathing and crunching had stopped. "I don't hear anything," he said, yawning. "It was just there. Please look." "Outside," I begged. With an exaggerated sigh, Dad pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. He stood there for a moment, then shrugged. "Nothing there, boys. Just snow and trees. Now get back to bed and stop with these stories." But we refused. We were absolutely terrified. Eventually, Dad gave up and let us sleep on the couch in the living room, muttering about overactive imaginations as he went back to bed. Danny and I huddled together under a blanket, too scared to close our eyes. The living room had large sliding glass doors that faced the same backyard. We stared at those doors all night, expecting that creature to appear at any moment. Around 3 in the morning, our beagles, who slept in the kitchen, suddenly erupted into frantic barking. Not their normal barking at a squirrel or raccoon, but panicked, terrified barking. They were throwing themselves against the kitchen door that led to the backyard, growling and howling. The commotion woke everyone up. Mom and Dad came rushing down the hallway in their pajamas. Dad told us to stay put while he checked on the dogs. Mom turned on all the outside lights. The dogs were hysterical, clawing at the door, desperate to either get out or get away. I couldn't tell which. Dad had to physically pull them back to look outside. When he opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the back porch, the dogs wouldn't follow. They cowered behind his legs, still barking but refusing to go outside. Dad shone his flashlight around the yard but didn't see anything. He was about to come back inside when Mom called out from the living room. "Robert, come look at this." There was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Fear. We all gathered at the sliding glass door in the living room. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, on the outside of the glass, were several enormous handprints pressed into the condensation. They were at least twice the size of my dad's hands, with long fingers that ended in what looked like claws. The prints were smeared with mud and what might have been pine sap. Most disturbing of all was how high up they were. The lowest print was at least 7 feet off the ground. Whatever had made them would have had to be tall enough to lean down to press against our window. Dad was 6 feet tall, and he would have needed a ladder to reach that high. "What in God's name?" Dad whispered, all his skepticism gone. The dogs were still barking frantically. Outside, the motion sensor light suddenly flicked on, illuminating the edge of the woods. For just a split second, I thought I saw movement, something large disappearing between the trees. Dad grabbed his shotgun from the closet and went outside to investigate, but found nothing except for enormous footprints in the snow leading from our window back to the forest. The prints were over 15 inches long and deeply pressed into the snow, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, Dad called a few neighbors to ask if they'd seen anything strange. No one had, though old Mr. Collins mentioned his cattle had been unusually agitated the past few nights. For weeks afterward, Danny and I slept in our parents' room. Dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property and started keeping his shotgun closer at hand. The dogs refused to go out after dark anymore. If we tried to force them, they'd whine and tremble. We never saw the creature again, at least not directly. But several times that winter, we'd wake up to find those massive footprints circling our house, always leading back to the forest. Sometimes we'd hear wood knocking sounds from the trees at dusk. The dogs never stopped being afraid. Eventually, we moved away from that house. Our parents never admitted they believed us, but they never discouraged us from locking our windows or keeping a baseball bat beside our beds either. To this day, I don't know what we saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some descriptions match what we encountered, but reading about something and seeing it face to face are very different things. I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some animal. The way it looked at us, there was intelligence there, purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. And sometimes, in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, watching and waiting for someone else to see it. Story 11. I've never told many people about what happened that night in '78. Most folks around here would just think I was hitting the moonshine too hard, or that I'm just another crazy old hunter with too many stories. But what I experienced that October night has stayed with me for over 40 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was late October, 1978. I was 32 years old then, and had been hunting these West Virginia hills since I was old enough to carry my daddy's .22. That night, I was out coon hunting along Miller's Ridge, not far from the old Harmon property. It was perfect hunting weather, crisp autumn air, clear skies with a bright moon overhead that cast long shadows through the trees. The leaves had mostly fallen, making it easier to spot movement in the woods. I had my two best hounds with me, Belle, my 7-year-old Redbone who'd never backed down from anything in her life, and Rusty, her 2-year-old pup who was still learning but showed real promise. Belle was the best hunting dog I'd ever owned. She'd treed more coons than I could count and even stood her ground against a black bear once. That dog feared nothing, at least until that night. I remember walking along the edge of Harmon's cornfield, about half a mile from my truck. The corn stalks had been cut down to stubble after harvest, and the moonlight made it almost as bright as dusk. Belle and Rusty were about 30 yards ahead, noses to the ground, doing what they do best. I had my old Remington shotgun slung over my shoulder and my trusty maglite in hand, though I wasn't using it much with the moon so bright. It must have been around 10:30 when everything changed. Belle was leading us toward the edge of the woods where the land drops off into a deep ravine. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her ears perked up and her whole body went rigid. I figured she'd caught scent of something good, maybe a big coon or even a fox, but then she did something I'd never seen before. She let out this sharp, panicked bark, not her treed bark or her alert bark, but something different, something scared. Before I could even process what was happening, she turned and bolted straight back to me, tail tucked between her legs, ears flattened against her head. When she reached me, she was trembling something fierce, pressing against my legs like she was trying to hide behind me. Now, you gotta understand, this was a dog that would chase a bear up a tree without hesitation. To see her so terrified sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October air. Rusty was still near the tree line, and he cautiously moved forward to investigate whatever had spooked Belle. But within seconds, he too turned and ran back, growling low in his throat and shaking like he'd seen the devil himself. He pressed against my other leg, and both dogs were now whimpering and trembling. That's when I heard it. From down in that ravine came the deepest, most resonant moan I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't like any animal I knew, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing I could identify. It was low and long, almost like someone blowing across the top of a massive empty bottle, but with a depth that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel it in my chest, like standing too close to a bass speaker. I pointed my flashlight downhill toward the ravine, but the beam couldn't penetrate the darkness down there. The ravine was deep, maybe 40 feet down, with thick vegetation and old-growth trees. Whatever made that sound was hidden from view. For a few seconds, everything went silent. Even the normal forest sounds, the crickets, the frogs from the nearby creek, everything just stopped. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. Then, without warning, there was a tremendous crash from the ravine. Like something had picked up a boulder and thrown it into tree branches. The sound echoed across the valley, and my dogs pressed even harder against my legs, whimpering louder. What came next still makes the hair on my neck stand up. 2 distinct, deliberate knocks, like someone taking a heavy stick and slamming it against a tree trunk. Knock, knock, clear as day, with about a second between them. Not random sounds, but purposeful. Almost like a signal. I've been a hunter my whole life, and I know every sound these woods make. This wasn't a falling branch or a deer stamping its hoof. This was something intentional. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was another hunter, though I couldn't imagine who'd be down in that steep ravine in the dark. "Anyone down there?" No response, just silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush down in the ravine. Not the light steps of a deer or even the waddle of a bear. These were heavy, deliberate steps that snapped branches and crushed vegetation. Whatever it was big, and it was moving parallel to us along the bottom of the ravine. I swept my flashlight back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was down there, but the light just wasn't strong enough to penetrate all the way down. I thought I saw movement once. Something dark moving between trees. But it was so quick I couldn't be sure. What struck me as most disturbing was how this thing, whatever it was, showed absolutely no fear. Most animals, when they hear a human voice or see a flashlight, will either freeze or run away. This thing just kept moving, like it didn't care that I was there, like it wasn't afraid of me or my dogs or my light. After about a minute of those heavy footsteps, there was another deep moan, further away this time, like it was moving off, then two more of those deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, from further down the ravine. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, frozen in place with my terrified dogs. Part of me wanted to go down into that ravine and see what the hell was down there. The larger, smarter part of me knew better. I'd been hunting these woods long enough to know when something wasn't right, when something was dangerous. I decided to head back to my truck. The dogs didn't need any encouragement. They practically pulled me back across that cornfield. Belle, who normally would range ahead checking scents, stayed right against my leg the whole way back. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on my back the entire time. When I got home that night, I told my wife Martha something had spooked the dogs, but I didn't go into detail. I didn't want her worrying about me going out hunting alone, which I'd been doing for decades. The really strange part came 3 days later. I decided to go back out to the same area, figuring whatever animal had been there was long gone. I drove to the same spot, parked my truck, and opened the back to let Belle and Rusty out. They wouldn't budge. Belle, who normally leaped from the truck the moment the tailgate dropped, just stood there, hackles raised, staring toward the woods. Rusty tucked himself into the corner of the truck bed, trembling. I called them, tried to coax them with treats. Nothing worked. They flat out refused to get out of that truck. In 40 years of hunting with dogs, I'd never seen anything like it. These dogs lived to hunt. It was in their blood. But something about that place had traumatized them so badly they wouldn't even set paw on the ground there. I gave up and drove home, genuinely unsettled. A week later, I was at Jenkins' General Store when I ran into Mike Caldwell, who owned the property next to Harmon's. He mentioned he'd been out with a hunting party the previous weekend, and strangely, they hadn't seen a single deer, despite that area usually being abundant with them. "Weirdest thing," Mike said. "That spot usually has deer trails all over. This time, nothing, like they've all cleared out." A couple weeks after that, I happened to speak with Old Man Harmon himself. He mentioned his cattle had been acting peculiar lately, staying close to the barn, refusing to graze in the pasture that bordered those woods, especially near the ravine. He'd even found his entire herd clustered together on the far side of his property one morning, as far from those woods as they could get. I didn't connect all these things at the time. I figured maybe a mountain lion had moved into the area, though we hadn't had confirmed sightings in years. Or maybe a particularly aggressive black bear. But neither explanation felt right. Bears and mountain lions don't make those sounds, and they certainly don't knock on trees. Years passed. I eventually got new hunting dogs after Belle and Rusty passed on, but I never took them to that spot again. I found other places to hunt, other ridges and hollows that weren't tainted by the memory of that night. Then, around 2005, I was watching this documentary on TV about Bigfoot encounters. I was half paying attention, more amused than anything, when they started talking about something called wood knocks. Apparently, these were sounds reported by people who claimed to have encountered Sasquatch, deliberate knocking sounds like something striking a tree with a heavy stick. They played a recording, and I felt my blood run cold. Knock, knock. It was identical to what I'd heard that night in '78. The exact same cadence, the exact same sound. The program went on to explain how these supposed creatures were known to make deep, moaning vocalizations and were powerful enough to throw heavy objects. I'm not saying I encountered Bigfoot that night. I've always considered myself a practical man, not given to wild beliefs or tall tales. But I know what I heard, and I know what my dogs experienced. Something was in those woods that night. Something powerful enough to terrify dogs that feared nothing else. Something intelligent enough to make deliberate signals. Something heavy enough to move through dense forest without concern for what might be hunting it. To this day, I still avoid that stretch of woods. I've never told many people this story because, well, who'd believe it? But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods and the sun starts to set, I remember those sounds. That moan that vibrated through the ground, those deliberate knocks echoing through the trees, those heavy footsteps moving without fear through the darkness. And I wonder what exactly was watching me from that ravine on that clear October night, and if it's still out there in those hills, watching others who venture too close to its territory. Story 12. I've never really told this story outside my family. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a bit. I'm 60 years old, and what happened to me as a kid still gives me nightmares sometimes. Back in the mid-70s, my brother Michael and I lived with our parents on this huge property in North Bend, Washington. We had about 200 acres that backed up against Rattlesnake Ridge. Our dad worked for Boeing, and our mum stayed home with us. My grandfather had been in logging, so we grew up around stories of the woods and knowing what it was like out there. The property had these gorgeous lower pastures where we'd spend practically every day when weather permitted. We were typical boys, always climbing, exploring, getting dirty. Our favorite thing to do was to climb these young alder trees. They were perfect because they had smooth bark and were flexible enough that we could climb up pretty high, then sort of swing down as the branches bent under our weight. We'd gotten so good at it that we knew exactly how much weight each type of tree could take before branches would snap. We knew every sound those woods made. What a rabbit sounded like moving through underbrush versus a raccoon. What wind through the trees sounded like during different seasons. Those woods were our second home. It was late autumn in 1976, or maybe early 77. I was 11 and Michael was 9. The day started like any other Saturday. We finished our chores and headed down to the lower pastures to play. It was chilly but clear, probably around 50 degrees. We'd been climbing trees for about an hour, racing each other to see who could get higher. I remember I was winning because I was older and taller, which Michael hated. We were about 400 feet downslope from the main house, far enough that we couldn't see it through the trees, but close enough that we could have run home in a few minutes if needed. The trees were mostly alders and some pines, with thick underbrush between them. The ground was still a bit wet from rain earlier that week. I was about 15 feet up my tree when I first heard it. At first, I thought maybe it was a tree falling somewhere in the distance. Living near logging operations, we'd heard that sound before. But this was different. It was branches and logs snapping, not just small twigs, but sounds like huge logs breaking in half. The popping noises were so loud and powerful that they echoed through the trees. I froze where I was, and I could see Michael in his tree about 20 feet away doing the same thing. Neither of us said anything at first, we just listened. The sounds were getting closer, moving toward us through the woods. The best way I can describe it is like a bulldozer driving through the forest, like something was just plowing over big trees. My grandfather had worked in logging his whole life, so I knew what heavy machinery sounded like moving through woods. But there were no logging operations happening anywhere near our property, and this sounded different. There was no engine noise, just the destruction. Michael looked at me with these wide eyes. "What is that?" he called over, his voice shaking. "I don't know," was all I could say. I started climbing down immediately, and he did too. Whatever was coming, my instinct said we shouldn't be trapped up in trees when it arrived. We both reached the ground and stood close together, looking in the direction of the sounds. They were getting louder, closer. Whatever it was heading straight for us. Then the crashing suddenly stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 3 in the afternoon. The thing, whatever it was, had stopped moving about 30 yards from where we stood. We couldn't see anything through the thick trees and brush, but we knew something was there watching us. That's when we heard it, a roar so powerful it physically shook my body. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing from any nature documentary. It was deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, like really low, loud bass hitting your chest at a concert, but 100 times more powerful. It seemed to come from something massive, something with lungs bigger than any animal I knew existed. Michael grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. I didn't even feel it then. For a second, we just stood there, paralyzed. Then survival instinct kicked in, and we ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, up that hill toward our house, tripping over roots and slipping on wet leaves. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of what I might see. We burst into the kitchen where our mom was making dinner, both of us breathless and terrified. We tried to explain what had happened, talking over each other, our words tumbling out. Mom just shook her head. "You boys and your imagination. It was probably just a bear," she said, turning back to the stove. "Or maybe loggers working on the next property over." But it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't loggers. We both knew that. We never went back to the lower pastures to play after that day. Michael flat out refused, and I didn't push it. Unfortunately, one of my chores was feeding the cattle in the early mornings before school, which meant walking near that area in the pre-dawn darkness. Every morning, I'd hurry through my tasks, constantly looking over my shoulder, imagining that something was watching me from the tree line. For a few years, life went on. We didn't talk about what happened much, even between ourselves. It was easier to try to forget about it than to remember the fear. Then, in either 1980 or 81, I was 15 or 16 by then, I had my second encounter. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to pee. My bedroom was on the second floor of our house, with this big window that faced the backyard and the forest beyond. We never had blinds or curtains because we lived so far from neighbors. The window gave me a clear view for about 20 to 25 feet to where a group of trees started and a dirt road led downslope toward the barn and those lower pastures. It was a clear night with a harvest moon, so everything outside was bathed in this bright silvery light. I sat up in bed and immediately froze. There, walking along the tree line, was something I can only describe as massive. It moved with these huge, smooth strides, not lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that size to move. It was almost like it was gliding. Its shoulders were as wide as a sheet of plywood, I'd guess 4 or 5 feet across at least. Its chest looked about 3 feet thick. We had a 5-foot fence that ran along part of the property, and this thing's mid-rib cage was even with the top of that fence. I'd estimate it stood between 8 and 10 feet tall. The creature crossed our asphalt road in just 2 strides. A normal person takes 5 or 6 steps to cross that same distance, and it moved so silently, not a single twig snapping, not a sound. I couldn't see details of its face or features in the moonlight. It was more of a silhouette. But I could see that it was covered in something dark, and it had this distinctive profile with a somewhat conical head, not flat on top like a human's. I was so scared I could barely breathe. I flipped my illuminated alarm clock face down so the light wouldn't attract attention to my window. Then I just lay there, completely still, too terrified to move. I needed to pee so badly my bladder hurt, but there was no way I was getting out of that bed. I thought the thing could reach up through my window and grab me. I didn't know what it might do. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any sound, watching for any movement outside. When the sun finally came up, I practically ran to the bathroom, then downstairs where my parents were having coffee. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but my dad just shrugged it off. "Probably just a black bear standing on its hind legs," he said. "They can look pretty big that way." But I knew better. I'd seen bears before. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk on 2 legs with smooth strides across hundreds of feet. Bears don't have shoulders that wide or stand that tall. My siblings believed me at least, Michael especially. He didn't need convincing. He'd heard that roar too. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. I've looked into every possible explanation. but I've never found anything that matches what Michael and I experienced. I'm 6'2" now, not a small guy by any means, but I still get this feeling of being tiny and vulnerable when I think about that thing in the woods. I've only been back to North Bend a few times since I moved away for college. Each time I find myself looking toward those woods, wondering if it's still out there, wondering if other kids have heard that bone-shaking roar or seen that massive silhouette crossing their yard in the moonlight. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened to me. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, even now, I find myself reluctant to look out the window. Some part of me is still that terrified kid, afraid of what might be looking back. Story 13. I've been debating for weeks whether to post this. It happened 41 years ago, but sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking about it. I've never been able to explain what happened that night in Leesburg, and neither has anyone else who was there. It was July of 1982. I was 12 years old, and like every summer since I could remember, our family was spending the 4th of July weekend at my Uncle Rob's cabin. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom place my grandfather and uncle had built themselves back in the 60s, but to us kids, it was paradise. The cabin sat deep in the woods of Virginia, about 20 minutes outside Leesburg proper. You had to take this unmarked dirt road for almost 2 miles to reach it. It was built high on a hillside, overlooking a creek that ran about 30 feet below. The whole area was dense forest, oak, maple, and pine trees so thick you couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. That weekend, there were 5 of us kids there. Me, my brother Mike, 14, and our 3 cousins. Danny, 13, Eric, 12, and Robbie, 11. Uncle Rob was watching us while our parents were at some wedding in Richmond. We loved these weekends because Uncle Rob was the cool uncle who let us stay up late, drink soda, and tell ghost stories around the fire pit. The first 2 nights were normal. We fished in the creek during the day, played capture the flag in the woods, and at night we'd make s'mores at the fire pit while Uncle Rob told us stories about Vietnam, or the time he swore he saw a UFO over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sunday was supposed to be our last night, and we were all kind of bummed about having to go back home the next day. Around 7 in the evening, it started to drizzle. Not enough to soak you, but enough to kill our plans for the fire pit. Uncle Rob wasn't about to let our last night be ruined, so he lit up these old oil lanterns and set them around the deck that wrapped around the back of the cabin. "We'll make the best of it," he said, bringing out a bag of marshmallows and some hot dogs we could cook on the propane camp stove. The deck faced the creek, and beyond that was another steep hillside dotted with massive boulders. In the daytime, it was nothing special, just more woods. But at night, with only the dim glow of those lanterns, it looked like something from a horror movie. You couldn't see anything over there, just darkness. I remember sitting on the deck, bundled up in my hoodie because of the light rain, when I first noticed how quiet it had gotten. Virginia woods at night are loud. Frogs, crickets, whippoorwills, you name it. But suddenly, everything just stopped. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. "You guys hear that?" Danny asked. "Hear what?" Uncle Rob replied, flipping a hot dog on the camp stove. "Nothing. That's what's weird. It's too quiet." Uncle Rob paused and cocked his head to the side. "Huh, you're right." That's when we heard it, a high-pitched scream from across the creek. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. It was somewhere in between, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered. Uncle Rob stood up slowly. He'd been in Vietnam, and I'd never seen him scared of anything, but I could tell by the way his body tensed that whatever made that sound had him on edge. "Everyone stay put," he said, walking to the edge of the deck. He grabbed one of the lanterns and held it up, trying to see across the creek, but the light only reached about 15 feet into the darkness. Then we heard branches breaking, heavy footsteps. Something big was moving around on the other side of the creek, crashing through the underbrush. It sounded like it was pacing back and forth. "Maybe it's a bear," Eric suggested, his voice cracking. Uncle Rob shook his head. "Bears don't scream like that." The screaming came again, louder this time, and it seemed closer. It was this awful, shrieking howl that made me want to cover my ears and run at the same time. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds before cutting off abruptly. "What could make a sound like that?" Uncle Rob muttered, more to himself than to us. That's when the first rock hit the deck. It wasn't a pebble or a small stone. It was a chunk of rock about the size of a softball, and it slammed into the wooden deck with enough force to make a dent. We all jumped, and Uncle Rob dropped the lantern. Thankfully, it didn't break. "Inside now!" he yelled. But before any of us could move, another rock hit the side of the cabin with a loud thunk. I looked across the creek. The distance to the other hillside was at least 100 feet. Even a major league pitcher couldn't throw a rock that size, that far, with that much force. But they kept coming, one after another, pelting the deck, the cabin walls, even shattering one of the windows. We scrambled inside, Uncle Rob practically shoving us through the door. Once we were in, he slammed it shut and locked it, then started moving around the cabin, closing and locking all the windows and shutters. "What's happening?" Robbie was crying now, and I wasn't far from it myself. "I don't know," Uncle Rob said, and that scared me more than anything. Adults were supposed to have answers. The rocks continued to hit the cabin for another 5 minutes or so. Some hit so hard the whole structure shook. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The screaming stopped too. Everything went dead quiet again. We huddled in the living room, too scared to make a sound. Uncle Rob had his hunting rifle out now, loaded and ready by the front door. None of us slept much that night. I kept thinking about what could be out there, what could throw rocks that size from that distance, what could make that horrible screaming sound. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight finally peeked through the shutters, we all felt a little braver. Uncle Rob made us wait inside while he went out to check the damage. After a few minutes, he called us out. The deck was a mess, splintered wood where the rocks had hit, broken glass from the window, and the lanterns knocked over. But what really got me were the rocks themselves. They weren't just rocks you'd find by a creek. These were chunks of limestone that matched the boulders on the opposite hillside. Some of them weighed 15 or 20 pounds. No human could have thrown them that far. After a quick breakfast that none of us really ate, Uncle Rob decided we should check out the other side of the creek before heading home. I didn't want to go, but I was more afraid of staying at the cabin alone. We crossed the creek using some stepping stones about 50 yards downstream. The other side was steep and rocky, making the climb difficult. We found where some of the rocks had been dislodged from the hillside, fresh marks in the earth where something had ripped them out. But what really freaked us out was what we found about 300 yards into the forest. There were 2 rock formations, stacked 3 rocks high, in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. They looked like markers or totems of some kind. Uncle Rob swore they hadn't been there. The day before, when he'd hiked that same area looking for firewood. As we stood there, staring at those rock piles, we heard branches breaking deeper in the forest. Uncle Rob immediately ushered us back toward the creek. We practically ran all the way back to the cabin, packed our stuff in record time, and were on the road within 30 minutes. On the drive home, Uncle Rob made us promise not to tell our parents what had happened. "They'll never let you come back if they hear about this," he said. But I don't think any of us wanted to come back anyway. Years later, when I was in college, I brought it up with Uncle Rob at Thanksgiving. He'd had a few beers and was more willing to talk about it than he'd been before. "You know what that was, don't you?" he said quietly, making sure none of the other adults could hear. "No," I replied, though I had my suspicions. "Sasquatch," he said simply. "I've been hunting those woods for 40 years, and I've never heard or seen anything like what happened that night. But I've talked to some of the old-timers around Leesburg, and they've got stories. They call it the Screamer. I've done my research since then, I've read about rock throwing as territorial behavior, about how Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings often include reports of high-pitched screams and sudden silence from other wildlife, about how they supposedly build rock formations to mark their territory. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I can't explain how something could throw rocks that size across a 100-foot gap with enough force to damage a cabin. I can't explain what made that horrible screaming sound. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the deep woods since that night. And to this day, when I hear branches breaking outside my window at night, I freeze, waiting to hear that scream again. Story 14. I've been hunting these Georgia woods for over 20 years now, and I've always prided myself on knowing the land, the animals, and their habits. When you spend as much time in the wilderness as I have, you develop a sixth sense for things that don't belong. That's why what I'm about to share has haunted me for years. It started about 8 years ago during a particularly cold December. The ground was frozen solid. We'd had temperatures below freezing for almost a week straight. I was out checking my trail cameras before the season opened, walking an old service road that runs beneath some power lines. These utility corridors make natural travel paths for deer moving between feeding and bedding areas. I noticed them right away, tracks pressed into the frozen ground. At first, I thought another hunter had come through, but something wasn't right. They were barefoot prints, human-shaped, but massive, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. The stride length between them was close to 4 feet. Who the hell would be out here barefoot when it's 15 degrees? I followed them for about a quarter mile before they veered off into a thicket so dense I couldn't track them further without making a ton of noise. I took some photos with my phone, but honestly, they didn't capture the bizarre nature of what I was seeing. The prints were pressed into the frozen ground, not just sitting on top of frost or snow. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I didn't tell anyone at first. My hunting buddies would have thought I was losing it or trying to scare them away from my honey hole. My wife Lisa just nodded when I mentioned it, probably thinking I was exaggerating like I sometimes do about the monster buck I almost got. But then I found more tracks, different locations, same general area, always along power line cuts or old logging roads, places that provide easier travel through the rugged terrain around Rome. Our hunting property borders 3 small lakes with numerous creeks crisscrossing through dense woods. The ridges are steep, with sections of old-growth forest that rarely see human traffic, perfect habitat for something that wants to stay hidden. Last fall, things escalated. Lisa had started coming hunting with me occasionally, not to shoot anything, just to enjoy nature and photograph wildlife. We were setting up a ground blind near one of the creek crossings when she froze, staring at something on the ground. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing at a fresh impression in the soft creek bank. It was another footprint, this one absolutely fresh. The edges were still crumbling, water slowly seeping in from the sides. Whatever made it had passed through minutes earlier. What happened next still bothers me. Lisa, who I've seen stand her ground against an angry black bear in the Smokies, grabbed my arm and said, "We need to leave, now." She's never explained what spooked her so badly, just says she got a feeling of being watched that made her skin crawl. We packed up immediately and hiked back to the truck. She hasn't come hunting with me since. These tracks weren't my first experience with whatever roams these woods. Years earlier, back when I still lived in Ohio, I saw something I've never been able to explain. I was bow hunting from a tree stand, positioned about 20 feet up an old oak tree. It was late afternoon in October, prime time for deer movement. I'd been sitting motionless for hours when I heard something large moving through the underbrush. Not the delicate steps of a deer, but heavy, deliberate movement. What emerged wasn't a deer or bear or anything I recognized. For a brief moment, maybe 5 seconds, I saw what looked like a massive orangutan with reddish-brown hair moving on 2 legs through a small clearing about 50 yards away. But this thing was huge. I'd estimate 7 or 8 feet tall, Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees. It moved with a fluid, rolling gait that seemed both awkward and incredibly efficient. Then it was gone, disappearing into thick cover before my brain could even process what I'd seen. I sat there shaking, bow forgotten in my lap. Nothing came through that clearing for the rest of the evening. Not a single deer, not even a squirrel. The woods had gone silent. I told myself it was a bear walking upright, or maybe even a person in some kind of ghillie suit. But I know bears. I know how they move. This was something else entirely. After moving to Georgia, I'd put that experience behind me until finding those tracks. Now I wonder if whatever I saw in Ohio has relatives down here in the Appalachian foothills. The incident that finally convinced me I wasn't imagining things happened just 3 months ago. I'd set up a series of trail cameras in areas where I'd found tracks before. For weeks, I got nothing unusual, just the normal parade of deer, coyotes, and occasional bobcat. Then one morning, I went to check a camera that had been positioned facing a game trail beneath the power lines. The camera was gone, not just fallen off its tree, completely gone. The heavy-duty strap I'd used to secure it had been snapped clean through. 20 feet up the service road, I found the camera smashed to pieces, its memory card missing. This wasn't the work of a bear or vandals. The location was miles from any public access point on private property. Whatever destroyed my camera had recognized what it was and deliberately removed any evidence it might have captured. That same day, I found more tracks, this time accompanied by something else that sent a chill down my spine. Beside one of the massive footprints was a clear handprint pressed into the mud. It looked almost human, but with fingers nearly twice as long as mine and a thumb positioned at an odd angle. The print was so detailed, I could see what looked like dermal ridges, fingerprints in the mud. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. I'm a practical guy who spent his life in the outdoors. I can identify every animal in these woods by their tracks, scat, or movement patterns. I know what a black bear print looks like when it's walking on its hind legs. I know how coyotes move through underbrush. I know when a deer has been taken down by predators versus died from natural causes. What I've found doesn't match anything in my experience. And I'm not the only one who's noticed strange things in these woods. My neighbor Ted, who owns property adjoining mine, mentioned finding his hunting blind completely destroyed last season. The aluminum frame bent and twisted in ways that would require enormous strength. He blamed it on damned vandals, but there were no ATV tracks or human footprints anywhere in the area. Another local hunter reported hearing bizarre vocalizations near Rock Creek after dark. Not quite human, not quite animal. Like someone trying to imitate a coyote but getting it wrong, he described it. I've heard things too. Twice now, while walking back to my truck after dark, I've heard wood knocks, 3 distinct sounds like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. Once, I heard what sounded like a tree being pushed over, followed by heavy movement through the forest. I swept my flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing. Most disturbing was what happened when I tried setting up a blind near one of the areas where I'd repeatedly found tracks. I'd hauled in materials over several days, building a small, permanent structure about 8 feet off the ground. The morning after I finished it, I returned to find it completely dismantled, not destroyed, but methodically taken apart. Every screw had been removed. The lumber was stacked neatly beside the tree. My tools were arranged in a row on top of the wood pile. This wasn't vandalism. This was a message. I've only told a handful of people about what I've experienced. Most react with skepticism or outright disbelief. One friend suggested I watch less History Channel. Another recommended I lay off the bourbon while hunting. But a few have shared their own strange encounters in these woods. One described finding deer carcasses placed in trees 15 feet off the ground, not dragged there by scavengers, but deliberately positioned. Another mentioned finding strange stick structures deep in areas rarely visited by hikers. Last week, I finally decided to set up a night vision camera in an area where I'd found fresh tracks. I secured it with heavy-duty cables and camouflaged it thoroughly. When I returned 3 days later, the camera was untouched, but when I reviewed the footage, I found something unexplainable. At 2:17 a.m. on the second night, the infrared sensors triggered recording. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing appears in frame. Then, at the very edge of the camera's range, something moves. The image is grainy and dark, but I can make out what looks like a massive figure standing upright just beyond the camera's focus range. It appears to be watching directly toward the camera position. After about 30 seconds, it raises what looks like an arm and seems to point at the camera. Then, the video cuts to static. When the recording resumes a minute later, nothing is there. The remaining hours show nothing unusual. I've debated sharing this footage online but decided against it. Partly because it's so unclear it would prove nothing, but mostly because I've come to believe these creatures, whatever they are, deserve their privacy. They've managed to exist alongside us without most people ever knowing they're there. They seem intelligent enough to avoid cameras and recognize human technology. That's why I'm keeping my discoveries mostly private. Sure, part of it is fear of ridicule, but more importantly, I worry about what might happen if their existence became widely known. Some trigger-happy fool would undoubtedly try to hunt one down. Scientists would attempt to capture one. Their habitat would be overrun with curious thrill seekers. These creatures have stayed hidden for this long for a reason. If they wanted contact with humans, they've had plenty of opportunities. From everything I've observed, they simply want to be left alone to survive in the dwindling wild spaces we haven't yet developed. Sometimes when I'm sitting in my tree stand at dawn, watching the forest wake up, I get the distinct feeling I'm being observed as well. Not with malice, just curiosity, one hunter recognizing another. I've never felt threatened during these moments, just aware that I'm not the only intelligent predator in these woods. Last month, I found a fresh deer carcass near one of my stands. The kill was recent, the meat still warm. The deer's neck had been broken with tremendous force, but no meat had been taken. It was just left there, almost like an offering or acknowledgement of shared territory. I still hunt these woods regularly. I still set my stands and track deer, but now I pay closer attention to those moments when the forest goes suddenly quiet. I notice when the hair on the back of my neck stands up for no apparent reason. And sometimes, when I'm walking back to my truck after dark, I could swear I hear heavy footsteps pacing me just inside the tree line, always staying just out of sight of my flashlight beam. Whatever walks these woods has been here longer than me, and will likely remain long after I'm gone. I've made my peace with that. These forests are big enough for both of us. Story 15. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time. People tend to dismiss what they don't understand, and I'm not interested in being ridiculed. But after 45 years, I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, sweating, with that sound echoing in my head. I need to get this off my chest. This happened in September of 1976. I was 34 at the time and had been hunting since I was a boy. Hunting was in my blood. My father taught me, just like his father taught him. By that point, I'd hunted everything from deer to mountain lion across 8 western states and parts of Mexico. I wasn't some weekend warrior who got spooked by normal forest sounds. I knew the outdoors, respected it, and understood it. That weekend, my younger brother Miguel and I headed out to the edge of the San Gabriel Wilderness in Los Angeles County. We were after bobcats, which were plentiful in the area back then. The plan was simple. I'd take the ridge while Miguel worked the lower ravine area about half a mile away. We'd each find a good spot to set up, use our rabbit calls to attract predators, and hopefully bag a cat or two before dark. We arrived at our spot around 4 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the high 70s, with just a slight breeze coming from the west. I remember checking the wind direction carefully. As any hunter knows, you want to stay downwind of your prey. I found a good position on the ridge with a boulder at my back and a clear view of a small clearing about 60 yards ahead of me. The spot gave me good cover while still allowing me to see anything approaching. I was carrying my Remington 243, not the biggest caliber, but more than adequate for bobcat, coyote, and even smaller black bear. I'd taken dozens of animals with that rifle over the years. I also had my standard gear, binoculars, canteen, hunting knife, and a powerful aircraft landing light I'd modified for hunting. That light could cut through darkness like nothing else. It had saved my ass more than once when I'd stayed out too late. Miguel and I checked our watches, agreeing to start calling at the same time, even though we were separated by quite a distance. We planned to hunt until dusk, then meet back at the truck. At exactly 4:30, I started with my rabbit distress call. It's a simple device that mimics the sound of a dying rabbit. High-pitched, desperate, squeals that trigger the predatory instinct in carnivores. I'd been using this technique successfully for years. Make the sound for about 45 seconds, wait 5 to 10 minutes, then repeat. Patience is key. After my third series of calls, around 5:15, I heard movement in the brush about 100 yards to my left. I stayed perfectly still, controlling my breathing, finger resting lightly outside the trigger guard. I was expecting to see a bobcat, or maybe a coyote emerging cautiously from the chaparral. What happened next changed me forever. From that same direction came a scream. No, not a scream. A vocalization so powerful and unnatural that it felt like someone had dumped ice water down my spine. The sound started as a deep, guttural growl that rose rapidly into something between a roar and a scream, but with a quality I've never heard before or since. It was loud. Christ, it was so loud it seemed to vibrate the air around me. It sounded like it came from something massive, something with lungs bigger than any animal I knew lived in those mountains. I froze. 34 years of hunting experience, and for the first time, I was genuinely terrified. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I felt a wave of goosebumps rush across my entire body, and my mouth went completely dry. My mind raced through my mental catalogue of animal sounds. Bear, mountain lion, coyote, elk. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. This was different. This was wrong. I gripped my rifle tighter, suddenly very aware of how small a .243 caliber felt in my hands. Whatever made that sound was big, too big. Then I heard movement again, this time more deliberate, branches breaking, brush being pushed aside, and it was moving, not toward me directly, but in a wide arc to my right. That's when a cold realization hit me. It was circling to get downwind of me. Classic predator behavior, but executed with what seemed like deliberate intelligence. I raised my rifle, pointing it in the direction of the sounds, and switched on my landing light even though it was still daylight. I wanted whatever was out there to know I was armed. In retrospect, I think that light might have saved my life, because the movement stopped momentarily when the beam cut through the brush. Then it screamed again, closer this time, maybe 70 yards away. The sound was so overwhelming that I felt it physically, like pressure against my chest. It wasn't just loud. It contained something primal that triggered every survival instinct in my body. Run, hide, get away. But I knew running was the worst thing I could do. If this was a predator, and everything in my gut told me it was, running would trigger a chase response, so I stood my ground, swinging my light back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking me. For a few minutes, there was silence. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and my ragged breathing. I started to think maybe it had moved on, scared off by the light or the sight of a human with a rifle. Then I heard it moving again, this time behind me. Somehow, without making a sound, it had circled almost completely around my position. I spun around, nearly losing my balance, and pointed my rifle toward the new sounds. That's when I realized it was getting dark. The sun was sinking fast behind the mountains, and shadows were growing longer by the minute. I knew I needed to get out of there before night fell completely. I had maybe 30 minutes of good light left. I keyed my walkie-talkie, an old military surplus unit Miguel and I used to stay in contact. "Miguel," I whispered as loudly as I dared. "Miguel, do you copy?" After a few seconds of static, his voice came through, sounding tense. "I hear you, Victor. Did you hear that?" My blood ran cold. "You heard it too." "What the hell was that?" His voice was shaking. "I've never heard anything like it. I'm packing up right now." "Me too," I said. "I think it's stalking me. It's circling around, trying to get downwind." "Jesus Christ," Miguel said. "I'm heading back to the truck now. Don't wait, just get out of there." I started backing away slowly, keeping my rifle raised and my light sweeping the brush in front of me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted by something intelligent, something that understood what I was doing and was countering my movements. I'd taken maybe 10 steps when I heard it again, that ungodly sound. But this time it came from 2 different directions, almost simultaneously. There were 2 of them, communicating with each other. One was still behind me, and now another was off to my left, exactly where I needed to go to get back to the truck. They were cutting off my escape route. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle steady. Cold sweat ran down my back despite the warm evening air. I faced down charging boar, stood my ground against mountain lions, even had a close call with a grizzly in Montana. But nothing had ever made me feel this kind of fear. It was primitive, overwhelming. The light was fading fast now, and I knew I had to make a decision. Stay where I was and potentially face these things in the dark, or make a run for it while I could still see. I chose to move. I started walking rapidly toward the truck, not directly where I'd heard the second vocalization, but angling away, hoping to circle around whatever was out there. I kept my light moving, scanning constantly, rifle at the ready. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the dry ground and my own labored breathing. Everything alive seemed to be hiding, sensing the presence of something dangerous. I'd made it maybe 100 yards when I heard movement again, fast movement, crashing through brush about 50 yards to my right, paralleling my path. It was keeping pace with me easily, moving through dense chaparral as if it were nothing. Then I caught a glimpse of something through the trees, just for a split second as my light passed over it. Something large, moving on 2 legs, at least 7 feet tall. The shape was all wrong for a bear. Bears don't move like that, even when they stand up. This was upright, bipedal, but moved with a fluid grace that sent another wave of terror through me. I started running then, all pretense of careful movement abandoned. Pure survival instinct took over. I ran as fast as I could through the darkening forest, branches whipping at my face, stumbling over rocks and roots. The whole time, I could hear it keeping pace, sometimes getting closer, sometimes falling back, almost like it was toying with me. Then I saw the most terrifying thing of all. As I approached a small clearing, my light caught a large, dark figure crossing about 30 yards ahead of me. It was moving fast, but I saw enough. Massive shoulders, long arms, a silhouette that was unmistakably not human, yet walked upright like a man. It disappeared into the brush on the other side before I could process more details, but the image is burned into my memory. They were coordinating, trying to herd me, one behind, one cutting across my path, forcing me to change direction. This wasn't animal behavior. This was strategy. By some miracle, I spotted the dirt road that led back to our parking spot. I broke through the tree line, gasping for breath, and saw the most beautiful sight of my life. Our truck, with Miguel already inside, engine running. He must have heard me coming because he flashed the headlights. I sprinted the last 50 yards across open ground, feeling completely exposed. The entire time, I expected to feel powerful hands grab me from behind, to hear that terrible scream right in my ear. But I made it to the truck, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside, dropping my rifle on the floorboard. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, and Miguel didn't need to be told twice. He floored it, the tires, spinning in the dirt before catching, and we tore down that forest road faster than was safe. We were both breathing hard, neither of us speaking for several minutes. Finally, as we hit the paved highway, Miguel looked over at me. "What the fuck was that, Victor?" His face was pale, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know." That night, back at my house, we drank nearly a full bottle of whiskey between us, trying to make sense of what happened. We talked about reporting it, but to who? And to say what? That we heard strange screams in the forest, that we caught glimpses of something impossible. I never went back to that part of the San Gabriel wilderness. In fact, I didn't go hunting alone again for nearly 5 years after that day. When I did return to hunting, I stuck to open country, places with visibility, and always with at least one partner. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know what I heard, what I saw. Those weren't normal animal sounds. That wasn't normal animal behavior. Whatever was in those woods that day was intelligent, coordinated, and hunting me as surely as I had gone there to hunt. Sometimes I still hear that scream in my dreams. I wake up sweating, heart racing, that same primal fear washing over me. My wife says I talk in my sleep on those nights, muttering the same thing over and over. They're circling, Asetu. Story 16. I've been debating whether to post this for years. Even now my hands are shaking as I type this out. What happened that night in September of 2011 still haunts me. I've told a few close friends, but most people just think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. I'm not. I wish I was. I lived in this little house outside Hot Springs, Arkansas. Nice and quiet, dead-end road, perfect place to raise a family. Our backyard opened up to this big field with a line of pine trees separating our property from a cornfield. Nothing special about it, just your typical rural Arkansas setting. That night, September 9th, I couldn't sleep. It was hot, even for September in Arkansas. Must have been around 2 in the morning when I decided to step out onto the back deck for a smoke. The moon was almost full, bright enough that I didn't even need to turn on the porch light. Just me, the crickets, and this beautiful stillness you only get in the countryside. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I heard it. A growl, not just any growl. This was deep, powerful, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It came from the tree line, maybe 100 yards away. My first thought was coyote, but this was too deep, too substantial. Coyotes have this yipping quality. This was a chest-rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the air. I stood there frozen, cigarette burning away between my fingers. Then it happened again. Louder this time, more forceful, same spot in the tree line. I'm not ashamed to admit I rushed back inside. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I nearly ran into my wife as I came through the door. She was heading toward the back door, looking concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I told her about the growl, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, her face went pale. "I've been hearing something like that for weeks," she admitted. "I didn't say anything because I thought you'd think I was imagining things." That's when I knew something wasn't right. My wife isn't the type to get spooked easily. For the rest of the week, we avoided going outside after dark, but curiosity got the better of me. I asked my oldest son to come with me to investigate that Friday after work. He's always been the adventurous type, so he agreed right away. We grabbed our phones for flashlights. Stupid, I know now. Should have brought actual flashlights and probably a gun too. And headed toward the tree line that bordered the southeast corner of our yard and the cornfield. As soon as we entered the trees, I noticed something odd. There were these stick formations everywhere, not just fallen branches, but sticks that looked deliberately placed. Some were leaning against trees, others formed these weird teepee-like structures. My son noticed them too. "Dad, someone's been out here," he whispered. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But we kept going. The tree line opened up into this wide, overgrown field. The grass was tall, over 5 feet in some places. One side of the field was swampy with cattails, which was strange because we hadn't had much rain lately. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I saw movement near some trees about 200 feet away. Just a flash of something dark. I pointed it out to my son, and we moved toward it. The area led to a small creek with a heavily used deer trail crossing it. We looked for prints in the soft mud along the creek bank. That's when my son called me over. "Dad, look," he said, pointing. "There's something over there." I followed his gaze and saw it. Something dark crouched at the base of a large tree about 300 feet away. I blinked, trying to get a better look in the fading light, and when I looked again, whatever it was had vanished. We followed the trail to a wider creek and decided to split up to cover more ground. My son went upstream while I headed downstream. Big mistake. After about 10 minutes, he called me over to see something he'd found. It was a small clearing surrounded by thick brush in a U-shape. The grass in the center was unusually bright green, standing out from everything around it. As I got closer, a smell hit me that almost made me gag. Rotting meat mixed with sulfur, but stronger than anything I'd ever smelled before. We searched the area, but couldn't find any dead animals or anything else that would explain the smell. The sun was starting to set, and I suggested we head back. We crossed the larger creek and followed the deer trail back the way we came. That's when everything changed. My son suddenly stopped walking. I nearly bumped into him. He was standing completely still, staring intently to his left. I followed his gaze, but couldn't see anything unusual at first. Then, from beneath some low-hanging branches, I saw what had caught his attention. There, about 100 feet away, stood the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was massive, hairy, and standing upright on 2 legs. It was leaning slightly forward, its upper body swaying slowly back and forth in this hypnotic way. The thing had to be at least 7.5 feet tall, probably weighing well over 600 pounds. It was covered in this dark, reddish-brown, matted hair. Its arms hung way past its knees. The legs were wide and looked powerful, like tree trunks. And its face, I only caught glimpses because it was partially covered in hair, but what I could see looked disturbingly human-like. Not human, but human-like. It was watching us from behind some saplings, not moving except for that slow swaying. Time seemed to stop. I don't know how long we stood there, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. My son and I were frozen in place, neither of us breathing. I finally managed to touch his arm, and we slowly, carefully started backing away. Every few steps, we'd look behind us, terrified it was following. We eventually made it back to our backyard. Just as we reached the edge of our property, we heard 2 loud knocks coming from the northern tree line. They were clear, forceful sounds, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Wood striking wood, deliberate. We ran the rest of the way to the house and locked the door behind us. My wife took one look at our faces and knew something had happened. I've never been the same since that day. I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters. I've joined online groups, talked to experts, even gone back to those woods several times, never alone, to look for evidence. My wife thinks I've lost my mind, and maybe I have. I've found more of those stick structures over the years. Once I found a footprint the size of my forearm in that same creek bed. I've heard the knocking sounds at least a dozen more times, always at night, always from that same area of the woods. I don't know what we saw that day. Some people would call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names make it sound like some cartoon character. This was real. This was terrifying. This was intelligent. The way it watched us, the way it seemed to understand that we had spotted it. I've installed security cameras around our property. I've recorded some strange noises, caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the tree line, but never anything as clear as what we saw that day. The worst part is the feeling that it's still out there, watching. Sometimes, when I'm alone on the deck at night, I get this overwhelming sensation of being observed. The dogs won't go near that part of the property anymore. They stand at the edge of the yard and bark at nothing, hackles raised. Last month, we found a deer carcass at the edge of our property. It wasn't torn apart like a coyote or wolf would do. The limbs had been removed cleanly, almost surgically, and the entire thing had been placed deliberately, not dragged or dropped. My son refused to go near it, said it reminded him too much of that day. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story, but I know what we saw. I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, in those woods, watching and waiting. I haven't been able to sleep through the night since. Every sound makes me jump. Every shadow seems to move. I keep the curtains closed at night now. I don't smoke on the deck anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it meant to show itself to us that day. If it was a warning or some kind of communication. I've read that these creatures are territorial, that they'll make themselves known if they feel threatened. My son moved away for college last year. He says one of the reasons he chose a school so far from home was to get away from those woods. He doesn't like to talk about what we saw, says he's tried to forget it. But I can't forget. I won't forget. Because forgetting means denying what happened, and I know what I saw. It was real. It was there. And for all I know, it's still out there right now, just beyond the tree line, watching my house, watching me. I don't go into those woods alone anymore. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I stand at my bedroom window and look out at the tree line, and sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see something looking back.